Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video. In this video, I'll be talking about my thoughts on the latest season of Australian Survivor, Blood vs. Water, which, for the most part, turned out exactly how I expected it to. Where I do think the theme of Blood vs. Water and seeing these pairs deal with playing the game while also managing their real life relationships was interesting to see and did lead to some complex dynamics across the season. But I mean, outside of that, this season really does still contain a lot of the typical flaws that you can expect from Australian Survivor, with really uneven editing, and through that a good chunk of the cast really just comes off as fodder. But also, I do think the season was lacking massive characters, which I do think part of that is due to the fact that Blood vs. Water is a theme that necessitates pairs, of which are typically cast for their dynamic together, more so than how entertaining they are as individuals, or if they are casting for a specific individual, that usually leads to them having a +1, being someone that isn't as interesting of TV. So again, it didn't really surprise me to see that this cast kind of came out as lackluster here, largely due to the consequence of this theme. And also, I don't think the boot order helped that either, but there definitely are some massive pros and negatives across the season. And just like in my other reviews, we'll be running through it by running through a season from beginning to end. And with that, let's start with the premiere, which starts with your typical ridiculously over-the-top cinematic intro with the players trekking through the outback, and along the way we do get introduced to some of the major characters here. First we get Jesse and Jordy, whose B-roll in particular I found really humorous as they're like ridiculously climbing over these hills in slow motion. Sophie and KJ get introduced here, both as alphas, which is not necessarily the way I would describe KJ throughout most of this season. And really, she comes off as this really cutthroat figure here, despite not really living up to that. Croc and Chrissy are highlighted as well, with Chrissy being one of the more prominent figures in the preseason, with a lot of focus around how she doesn't know anything about Survivor, which from a game standpoint, I do have a lot of issues with the fact that she didn't even bother to prep before coming out into the season. But she does end up being one of the more interesting characters here, and also has a sympathetic edit here with her talking about her adopted kids. Con and Amy also get introduced, with Amy instantly getting a storyline about wanting to get out of Con's shadow that at least have her in winter contention for me for a bit. Though Con does end up being the focal figure for this duo, with him ending up being one of the bigger characters across the season. But then we do get two players that are back for redemption, starting off with Andy and Kate, who I still find this such a bizarre casting choice that Andy was just randomly brought back here for a Blood vs. Water season. And right away, we do get talk about how he was lacking a social game and how Kate's going to be his social game, which by the time that we get to the tribes being divided and we have Kate talking about how's Andy going to do without his social game, this really screamed out to me right away that Andy was not going to do well on this season. But then we get introduced to the main characters in Mark and Sam, who get this really grand intro of like Sam narrating how they end up meeting on AU 2017, while Mark is the one that specifically gets to talk about them coming back to win this time and how it's a mission. And this really felt like a winner quote to me. And this only just starts off what ends up being a really strong premiere for Mark here, with him getting a lot of focus as an individual, while Sam's storyline is mostly revolved around her relationship with Mark here, which really had Mark above Sam for me in terms of winner contention. And really the overall casting of Mark and Sam here was one I was a bit hesitant with at first. Like, while it does make sense to bring back this couple that originally met on Survivor for Blood vs. Water here, I did not find them to be the most interesting TV or really players the first time around. So again, I was pleasantly surprised with being wrong about them here on the return and seeing them both end up playing stronger games here. Sam in particular, who I really did not expect to have learned from her mistakes last time, and did overall impress me as a player. But after this, we do have all the players on the mat, and then we hear a chopper coming, and that's when we get Sandra and Nina, them having this really grandiose entrance here of them landing on top of a cliffside, and we get this package about Sandra being the queen, and JLP constantly talks about how she's the 2-time winner and asks her, can she do it again? And all this really seemed to be putting like an even bigger target on her back here, though I did find the scene of her arrival just kind of humorous, with like Chrissy first saying, is that Oprah? And then we have like Sandra and Nina like having to slowly climb down the cliff. That did really lower the gravitas of the moment. But eventually we get to the tribes, dumbly named Blood Tribe and Water Tribe, which again is ridiculous on the offset, but even humorous in the sense that JOP even seems to know that this is so stupid and just doesn't even call them that and ends up just calling them red and blue throughout the season. So again, I found that funny. But then we get to the first reward challenge, which I felt like was also pretty dumb here, with them having this very physical comp where they had to go head to head with their loved one, no matter what sex they are. And this really led to a lot of really underwhelming matchups and really just felt like a challenge that they were doing for B-roll to use in commercials. But then we get to camp, which Blood Tribe gets very minimal content here, with most of it revolving around Sandra, who really has the same shtick as previous US seasons, with constant talk about how she's the queen. Though here she doesn't seem to come off as an initial target, with her tribe definitely having some reverence for her, and also I suspect also wanting to use her as a shield in the game, which I do think this is pretty much what happens to Sandra on most given seasons at this point. I mean, with the current reputation that she has, this massive legacy of a player, and also with her not really being the most threatening player on the offset, I do feel like the trajectory that she has on this season is pretty much the trajectory she would have on most given seasons. Now here we do also get introduced to Jesse, who has a solid premiere here, though proceeds to be invisible for a good chunk of the early game. That always had him like hovering outside of winner contention for me. Sophie also gets a decent intro here that really made her a top contender for these first couple episodes, though obviously later on her edit takes a massive negative turn. But again, I mean, really, Water gets most of the screen time here. I mean, Chrissy immediately comes out as this like fish out of the water, though one that I never felt like was a winning edit here, more so like kind of the start of like a journey edit possibly. Andy gets this massive like dodo edit here, with no one seeming to buy anything that he ends up saying, and he ends up taking control of the camp building, making him come off as a bit domineering, and also adding in that Andy had like a bad reputation coming into the season as this snake. It really did make it apparent to me that he was being set up as the first boot here. Mark's content here is really what kept him as a top contender to me right from the beginning, despite all the negativity that ends up coming to him later on, where he does get this individual intro with him talking about how he's been in the military, and along with that comes this ridiculous B-roll of him just walking around the jungle with this massive bow and arrow. But really, ever since they started these style of intros on Australian Survivor, the winner has always gotten their intro in the premiere. So obviously this was a good sign for him, but also he gets this confessional immediately afterwards that felt so reminiscent of the one Haley got in the premiere of last season, where Mark literally goes through his tribe one by one and talks about his thoughts on them, which at this moment I really did have them pegged as the winner from this point forward. Where even beyond this, he gets the foundation of his relationships with Jordy, Nina, and Khan. He also gets credit for the eventual Andy boot as well, while also talking about minimizing his threat level and letting Andy take the lead. So again, for me, I really felt like this was a perfect premiere for Mark here. Shay also gets introduced here, establishing her relationship with Ben and also showing her have an instant bond with Brianna, which did make her feel like a top contender early on, though obviously her edit ends up waning across the season. But here we instantly see her find a clue to an idol on the podium at Tribal, something that we had seen SA done in the past, and it was cool to see that here, though interestingly, this wasn't the only clue at camp, where Chrissy finds the second clue in front of the entire tribe, and I did like this element of hiding multiple of the same idol clue, leading to a race here to the podium for the idol, and that like element of it is fun, though kind of feels forced. Now, something that the show doesn't tell you is that this idol was actually only valid for the first round here, which does greatly recontextualize the events of this episode and also makes it very questionable at why Shay and Brianna are going so hard for this idol. But also, like, all this comes before the immunity challenge, while Blood Tribe didn't get content about this idol, even though it was very clear they also got these same clues. And through that, again, I knew right away that Water Tribe was going to Tribal. Now, at the challenge itself, we do find out that Alex has injured his back, which ends up leaving him out of commission really for the majority of his run here. Though it does become the red herring of the episode, where Andy continuously talks about how Alex is the easy vote due to his injury, but right away we do see people be hesitant to voting for him, with Chrissy calling him the perfect tribe mate, and along the way we do see the rise of Nina, who really gets a lot of credit in the edit here for pinning the vote on Andy, which I will say I don't think this is actually what happens. I mean, while I think for sure Nina wanted Andy gone and was part of the majority group, I feel like from watching the footage itself, you can clearly tell people were already on board with getting rid of Andy before Nina did anything. And we have Mark actually be the one to mention Andy's name in their conversation. And again, this is like edited as like, oh, Nina wants Andy out and she's like waiting for the right time for someone to mention Andy so she can turn the vote against him. But it's like, I think in reality, again, I think Andy was already going home. And I think they were just using this to prop Nina up in the edit. Though I will say that just from watching the footage, I do very much respect the tact that she was using through these conversations, where you can definitely tell how strategic she was being along the way. And really, again, like in this premiere, Nina does come off as a really strong player here, to where, dare I say, she might be a better version of Sandra. Obviously, with a lot less proof to back her game, and one that obviously, like, to fully say that we would need to see her multiple times and have more impressive appearances, but I just think from the offset, I was probably more impressed with Nina across this season than I was with Sandra on any of her individual seasons. But beyond this, I mean, along the way, we do get this subplot of Shay and Brianna wanting to target Chrissy and use the idol to do so, and again, all that just really felt dumb. Like, I really don't get why they felt the need to do so. But really, I did find it funny that coming into Tribal, that all the people involved here, and Shay, Brianna, and Chrissy were all planning on using the idol on Alex had they got it. But here we do get a bit of a crazy Tribal, where due to the race for the idol, where Shay and Chrissy both go for it, and Brianna tries to stop Chrissy, and again, all for a one-round idol, which was really pointless, especially considering Shay and Brianna weren't talked about at all as potential targets here, and had no reason to go for it. And I also felt like it was poor play from Brianna here, where she spends most of Tribal just making it very clear to Chrissy that she's targeting her, which again, at first makes you think, okay, she's trying to flush the idol. This is a good move. But then you realize the idol's only good for one round. The idol's flushed anyway if she doesn't use it. So again, this is just terrible gameplay on her end, and really just creates this vendetta with Chrissy that ends up moving forward to the next episode. But here, again, Chrissy does end up using the idol on herself, and then we do have the Andy boot, which was never in doubt for me. And I mean, let's talk about Andy. I do really feel for him here. I mean, he is a massive fan of the show, who had a really bad experience the first time around, and he comes back here just to have an even worse experience, being the first boot on the season. So I really feel for him on that front. I mean, also, I do feel like he was harmed by coming into the season with a bad reputation due to him coming off as really snaky the first time. And it did seem like Mark, Sam, and Nina all did have some sort of vendetta against him on the offset, with even Kate on the other tribe seeming to be harmed by this stigma of being associated to Andy. But that being said, though, I don't feel like he played well despite coming into the game in this really bad position, where I do think through his actions he really just further sealed his fate. And really, I do find his trajectory on this season kind of tragic, but also kind of notable in how much of a raw deal he got here. Now let's move on to episode 2, which was a strong one despite once again the boot being pretty apparent. Now, the Blood Tribe once again doesn't get much focus here, though the same figures do get most of the content here, with Sophie narrating the fire making scene and Sandra still being Sandra. But with Andy having been voted out, Kate starts to get content here, talking about how she's being targeted due to her association with Andy, which seemed to make her a very easy vote here, which again was expecting coming into the season. But also, this is where Sam finally gets her intro, which again, to get hers in episode 2 did make her look like less of a winner candidate than Mark to me, despite her being a more focal character throughout more of the season. But again, water is once again the tribe focused on here, with them going into Tribal once again. Now, Shay and Nina both get personal content early on that kept them both as top contenders here, with Shay in particular being up there with Mark to me after this episode, especially considering it seemed like they were kind of hiding her from the Brianna negativity. But considering her quiet edit ends up being a constant until we near the merge, her edit again just continues to go down for me over time. But this is also where Khan's edit and his threat level becomes more prominent in the edit, with him already being called King Khan, and this really ends up being the bulk of his content across the season. But really, most of this episode does revolve around Brianna, who does have a spectacular downfall here. Now, we do see more of her rivalry with Chrissy just wanting nothing to do with her, despite Bri trying to do damage control. We have the scene after the reward where Brianna clearly looks for an idol in front of everybody, and that was kind of ridiculous. We later have her campaigning against Chrissy to the entire tribe unsuccessfully, which, I mean, credit to Bri that she at least picks up on the fact that they're just telling her what she wants to hear, but really she doesn't do herself any favors throughout this episode and proceeds to go idol hunting with Shay, which leads to some intrigue where Khan ends up following them and ends up seeing Shay unhook the idol from the tree, and through that we have Khan, interestingly, actually being the first one to grab the idol, but ends up handing it to Shay, which was obviously the right play, as just outright steal the idol in that situation would have been very sketchy and would have made him even more threatening than he's already coming off. Through doing so, he also keeps the idol out of Brianna's hands. That does make her a very clear vote here, and I do like how he used the situation to make Brianna look even more sketchy to Shay by telling her that Brianna was trying to take the idol for herself. Also for Shay here, this essentially means that everyone knows about her idol, which does end up putting her in a precarious position. And really the main source of intrigue for this vote does come down to, will Shay play her idol on Brianna or not, which I never actually thought was going to happen, as it did seem like Shay was in a decent position in the tribe, considering they don't even split the vote on her, they split it on Chrissy instead, and really Brianna being there is just making her come off as more of a target. So again, I felt like the vote itself was pretty dull, and I thought it was pretty apparent Brianna was going home. But let's talk about Brianna, who, as I said, was the star of this episode, with her just further digging her grave. She is the type of player that just can't hide how actively they're trying to play the game, and will probably just sabotage their own game every time she plays. Again, she was a fun presence here, and she was a big fan, and you could tell how much she wanted to be out there. But again, as a player, she's definitely one of the more actively bad players on the cast. Now for episode 3, which felt like a bit of an inverse of the previous episodes, where here Blood gets almost all the content, while on Water, pretty much all of their content revolves around Khan. The episode starts with Khan being propped up as a mastermind once again, and we do see Mark return to the show, where his bond with Khan is highlighted, with them agreeing to play both sides, only for Mark to be wary of Khan, which sets up Khan's downfall moving forward. Now from the Blood Tribe, a lot of this episode does revolve around Dave. First with Sandra setting up a rivalry with him, with her targeting him due to him just being an easy vote. And later we do see him wanting to target Sandra as well, which, the entire Sandra-David rivalry here is just so funny to me, that Sandra has had legendary rivals on all of her seasons at this point. She's had Johnny Fairplay, Russell Hantz, she had Tony, she had Boston Rob, and now Juicy Dave, which again is humorous. But then we get to the reward challenge, where Dave finds out that Brianna is gone, and he really ends up taking it personally here. But the reward itself does go to the Blood Tribe, which ends up being a trip to the Survivor storehouse, where the tribe gets to pick a representative, and they pick Dave here over Sandra, which felt like a curious choice, really, for both options here, as neither of them seem to be part of the core majority group. But obviously Sandra's experience with the show at least makes her a more reasonable option here over Dave, who they picked just because they felt bad. And here Dave also gets to pick someone from the other tribe to bring over as well, and he does pick Khan. Ironically, the person that the edit portrayed as the one leading the charge against Brianna. And Dave talks about he picked him because he was trustworthy, which, this initial reaction to him ends up quickly turning as the reward scene proceeds, where Dave really handles this so poorly, where he gets the option to give Khan a reward and really just ends up turning him down, which was a really bad look, especially considering the point of this reward and you being able to share it is to build a cross-tribal relationship. And for Dave to just blow the opportunity here is pretty bad. But also both players are essentially handed an idol here as well. That was, kind of weird. And also it did have the co-wrong rules, where if they come together, they become a super idol. And that part of it just goes nowhere. But I do like that additional wrinkle to the idols here. But again, I just found it humorous again that Dave completely flips on Khan here, talking about how he wants to make Water Tribe pay for taking Brianna out and wants Khan to be his grenade to cause chaos. And this massive heel turn for David across this episode is so humorous, after he was, again, very invisible the first 2 episodes and ends up being very invisible moving forward as well. But both players here end up handling their idols a bit differently, where Khan just ends up straight up telling his tribe that he got one, which I get, as they definitely would have suspected him of having one anyway, and I do think this at least garnered him some level of trust, but it does seem to put this massive bullseye on him from this point forward, with constant talk about either flushing his idol or blindsiding him with it. Now, Dave doesn't end up telling anyone about it, but obviously everyone suspects that he does have one. But then we get to the immunity challenge that Sandra does particularly poorly in, and with that, along with the edit trying to make it seem like she was being targeted towards the beginning of the episode, and like Dave being shown to be right in targeting Sandra due to that being immediately after Sandra talked about targeting him. And also the focus that Sandra gets throughout this episode. Like, I really was actually tricked into thinking that Sandra was possibly going home here, especially considering the eventual boot, and Kate didn't get that much content here. But after a challenge, it does seem like Sandra and Kate are the possible targets, with Dave wanting to split the vote between them. But Sandra does talk about working with the alpha males, and does seem to be saved here by Ben, who talks about wanting to work with her moving forward. And we do get this vote starting to turn on Dave instead. And Sandra gets to talk about wanting Ben to do all of her dirty work, which really ends up being her MO on this season, of her making a plan with someone only to just let that person do all the work for her. But it does seem effective here, with the split vote now being between Kate and Dave instead of her, though this is also where we get the establishment of the Jesse and Sam relationship that ends up being a power duo moving forward. And also seems to play a major factor in this vote, with Sam getting a lot of the credit for keeping the votes off of Dave, but also wanting to target Sandra, which again the edit portrays as the correct move here. And while this doesn't end up going through, she does end up putting her sole vote on Sandra. And again, I did actually think that that was going to be the nail in Sandra's coffin here. I mean, now all of this scramble does eventually lead to Dave getting really paranoid, to where we get to Tribal, where we get a lot of fun with Dave blowing up his own game when the votes were again still on Kate coming into Tribal. But he decides to like really go after Sam, talking about how she's playing a really social game and playing with everyone. Again, the person that was trying to fight for him to stay, and really he just comes off as this like massive loose cannon here. But this does lead to a live Tribal, with Sam getting up and turning all the votes onto Dave, prompting him to use his idol, nullifying 8 votes, while Kate goes home with 3. But I will say, I do think most of the people in this round played this vote very poorly, where again in the position where you can feel confident that Dave has an idol, considering again he just went on the reward, I do think Sam makes the optimal move here by putting a vote on Sandra in the case of 2 idols, which again was a possibility considering both Shay and Nakan had idols on the Water Tribe. But also I do think a lot of those in danger in this vote should have also been trying to counter the vote split. And I do think the likes of Kate and Sandra not seeming to consider that did also feel like a misstep. But again, like I was surprised to see the votes land on Kate, as I did expect all this foreshadowing from Sam to lead to an eventual Sandra boot, but again, wasn't meant to be. And with that, let's talk about Kate, who was fine. I mean, she seems like a really likable figure out there. She was a big fan of the show. She seemed to be really excited to be out there with Sandra, and that was endearing, but she didn't really seem to have that much of a chance on this season. I mean, she was instantly being perceived as physically weak and being a part of this like older mom archetype, while also having this stigma of being related to Andy that seemed to give her really no leverage while out there, and it always just felt like an early boot to me. Though again, wasn't expecting it in this specific episode due to how quiet her edit was. Now for episode 4, which like last episode mostly revolves around the Blood Tribe, with the Water Tribe's content being revolved around Khan once again, and we get more of Mark targeting Khan here, this time with him actually leading the charge to flush Khan's idol, and we get the first use of the Khan is king in Arabic confessional that they use from Mark across the season. But also here we do see Mark openly telling his tribe that he's going to be playing Khan, and that if they see him talking one-on-one on him, it's just him keeping up appearances. And this seems very sketchy on paper, but instead it seemed like they were like okay with this, which I do think is an impressive display of Mark's game here. But really the Blood Tribe is where most of the fun from this episode ends up coming from, where we do see the ramifications of David blowing up his own game, where Sam is now directly targeting him, and Blood does end up winning the reward challenge, which has a Mark versus Croc matchup where JLP calls it King Kong versus Godzilla, which like I audibly laughed at how ridiculous that line was. But with the reward win, they are able to take a member to the other tribe. And this is obviously interesting considering the blood versus water dynamics here, and they do end up agreeing on Shay, during which Shay gets no confessionals to talk about this, while it is Ben that gets all the screen time here instead, which again really dunks Shay's winning chances to me. But also we do have Sophie coming out as a really big character once again here, with her talking about needing to bite her tongue and needing to blend in, as we have continuous shots of Sandra making it very clear that Sandra is going to be targeting her. Now we do get, for the first time here, talk about this core alliance that has been running the tribe with Sophie, Ben, Croc, and Jordan. That felt very similar to Joey's alliance from Brain versus Brawn, with Sophie being the Joey figure here that ends up taking the fall for it. But really, the edit does start to dunk on her here as well, with Sandra talking about how she has a lack of self-awareness, and really the edit just makes it very clear that she's being set up for a fall here. But immediately after the immunity challenge, we do find out that the Water Tribe will also be attending Tribal, which makes it very clear that there is going to be a Nana Lim here. Now, the plan is initially Dave, because obviously that's easy, but this is where we get a lot of Sandra and her getting a lot of the credit for flipping the votes here, which, again, most of it I do question if it's warranted. Now, we do see her create this plan with Michelle to target Sophie, and then we see her approaching Amy, and they agree to take out Sophie, which, again, this makes me question, like, was Amy already planning on taking out Sophie anyway, considering how quickly she agrees to it? And also, even if she wasn't, it is still the work of Amy that puts this vote into motion, where she is the person that we see going from person to person and wrangling the votes together. But again, the edit really gives all the credit to Sandra here, despite Amy, again, seeming to have a close relationship with Jay and Dave, her also being the one to approach Sam and Jesse, who are the swing votes here. Which, I mean, as a whole, I do find this to be a very questionable move for Sam, where this comes immediately after they do establish this Sophie-Sam relationship, that Sophie talks about how much she trusts Sam in the game. So to execute this move on a Nana Lim round just feels like a bad move on paper, but again, I do suspect that the flipping of the vote on Sophie was already a plan that most of the tribe had already been behind, which if that is the case, then obviously Sam sticking out her neck to stop this vote isn't ideal here. But we do get the tribal, where we do get a pretty clear Sophie vote. But I did find it interesting to see the other tribe there, as we do see the reaction from KJ to Sophie getting voted out, which made me think, like, why isn't every tribal like this? Again, like on a Blood vs. Water season, why not have both tribes at tribal and see the reactions from their loved ones? I think that would be a fun way to handle these sort of seasons moving forward. But again, here we get the shocking reveal that Sophie isn't going home and is instead swapping tribes, which was a very predictable twist, but one that wasn't game-breaking outside of the basic concept of a Nana Lim, and because of that, I really don't have much issue with how this was handled. And also kept around Sophie, who is a really strong villain for the show moving forward. So again, I'm fine with this twist. And with that, let's move on to episode 5, which does end up being a bit of a strange episode, dealing with the ramifications of the Nana Lim, and even the episode itself here not having a proper vote out. The Blood Tribe doesn't get much content on their own here, with the little that they do get being revolved around the reaction to Sophie still being in the game, and Jordan finally getting content to talk about him wanting to disassociate himself from her. And this is largely because the bulk of this episode does revolve around the reward, which I love this scene of them arriving at the challenge, and we see like Sandra hand motion to Nina to get rid of Sophie, which really felt like a Godfather move there. And the challenge itself ends up being Sumo at Sea, where we do have a lot of fun matchups, with the most notable of which being Sophie versus Sam, which really plays into the episode's themes. We do also get some interesting interactions, like Jesse telling Mark during the match that he should target Sophie. The challenge ends with Water winning, and in an interesting shakeup here, they do celebrate the reward at Blood Camp, which does allow the entire cast to be together, which would normally be weird, but considering this was Blood vs. Water, again, I do think it works out here. And along with that, Sophie ends up being able to interact with her original tribe. And that did lead to some intrigue with her telling Sam how hurt she is, and her getting upset at Jordan for him now siding with the enemy, which was a ridiculous moment, but also kind of a fun one. This scene does also have a lot of focus around Mark and Sam, once again making them feel like the main characters here, with Mark in particular narrating the entire scene, and also getting to talk about their family, which again was a positive sign for his edit. The immunity challenge also ends up being a pretty fun one here, and one that I was surprised to see Water not throw to just vote out Sophie, considering pretty much everyone seemed to be on board with getting her out. Instead, we have to see Blood like barely squeak out the win here, with Ben being the only one standing for quite a while, which was a pretty impressive effort. But to me, this did really feel like an obvious Sophie boot. And had they genuinely voted at Tribal, I do feel like she would have been the easy vote. Now, along the way, we do get KJ finally getting some true content with her now having Sophie on her tribe and talking about how her being there harms her game, with Sophie just putting a bigger target on her back. And we do have her being conflicted on whether or not to save Sophie. And she does end up creating this split vote plan against Khan. And we do get a lot of the same content around Khan about potentially blindsiding him with the idol. And again, I don't think that was ever happening, especially considering the editors made a faux pas here in the edit, in the fact that most of Khan's confessionals in this part of the episode have him clearly wearing the merge buff. And make it very clear he took these confessionals from his boot episode. So that makes me think that, again, I just don't think they had any footage to use from this round. But again, also shows how incompetent production is here to essentially spoil that Khan was going to make the merge with his idol as well. Again, in a position where Khan is a secondary target for most of this season. So all that really lowers the suspense for Khan throughout a lot of this. But also in this episode, we don't just have to talk about a split on Khan, but also a split on Shay, where we do see her bring up the idea herself of flushing her own idol. And again, I know a lot of people call this out as like, oh, what a terrible move. And like, I mean, I get it, but also I think it is very clear that on this season, the idea of having a public idol just puts a pretty big target on your back. And I get why Shay would want to get rid of that and gain some trust along the way by being extremely straightforward with what she was going to do. But obviously it would have been better and more ideal she was able to keep the idol and not have that stigma against her. Now along the way, we do also get a brief mention of Alex's back acting up again, and with that we come into Tribal, where he reveals that he wants to quit and wants everyone to vote him out, which they refuse to do, which again, I do think it was because they really wanted to get Sophie out here, especially with all their loved ones telling them to do so, and also they had the possibility of flushing idols here. So again, like, I get why they didn't want to go through this, but instead it just leads to Alex quitting, which was a sad farewell, but also just came off as very anticlimactic. And let's talk about Alex, who he was there. I mean, he was suffering from a back injury the entire time and didn't end up doing that much. And I do feel for him on that aspect, but he really just did not bring anything to the show, which was kind of underwhelming considering he was a big fan, and for him to have this negative experience on the show and for him to be pretty much purpled from the show outside of his injury. Again, that's gotta really suck there. I mean, I also do find it kind of funny how he seemed to be cast because of his relationship to Sam Frost, only for that to never actually get mentioned on their show. So again, didn't really get much from him on the season, despite the fact that, again, it seemed like his cast really did like him. But now we're moving on to episode 6, which bizarrely started with Jesse getting this pretty strong content about how everyone thinks he's a kid, but he's actually really playing the game, which was a really weird way to start this episode, especially considering Jesse once again becomes invisible for the rest of the episode. The Water Tribe doesn't get much content here, with Sophie and Khan still being the easy targets, and we do see Sophie trying to work with Khan, only for him to talk about not trusting her. And here again, he does imply that he was in on the last vote. That again further makes me think that the target that was supposedly on his back last round was a bit more of a red herring. The Blood Tribe does once again get most of the content here, and with that comes a lot of Sandra content, with us getting the mention of Sandra's Day 16 curse. That felt really weird. They abruptly mention it here an episode before Day 16. We do also see the return of the Sandra-Dave rivalry, with Sandra wanting to target him again due to him having voted for her back in episode 3, which was actually Sam. But this rivalry does end up transferring over to Amy instead, after Amy tries to save David and decides to try to target Sandra. And Sandra does do effective work here in approaching the alpha males that were left on the outs of the Sophie vote and turns them against Amy, which does help her win out this round. Now we do end up having an idol hunt where the trouble of Amy, Dave, and Jay go hunting for it, leading to Sam, Michelle, and Sandra searching as well to counter them, and this leads to Amy finding the idol in front of Sam and Michelle, which continues this trend of players having public idols. And Michelle ends up leaking this information to Sandra, who ends up using it as a way to pin the target on Amy to flush her idol. And along the way, we do get the first Michelle confessional. That was actually a pretty strong one, where she talks about being under the tutelage of Sandra, where, again, like, if this was episode 1, like, this would be a pretty decent intro to Michelle. But again, it's episode 6. And that really ends up being the only confessional that either of the twins end up having in the entire pre-merge, which is insane. And really a major indication of this season's poor editing. But even beyond all of this, like, Amy still tries to keep her idol a secret here, which did feel like poor play for her to not even tell her allies in this position. Again, the position where everyone else knows about her idol except for her allies. And also, this is a position where they could have easily worked together to try to use the idol successfully. And I think she could have used their idol as leverage to try to pin the votes back on Sandra. And I really feel like that would have at least been more effective than just hoping that it was a secret and then playing in an inopportune time anyway, as they do end up splitting the votes between Amy and Jay here, with the majority actually being on Jay, which I find very questionable as to why Jay is targeted here, which I guess I should mention, Jay does end up leaving this season with no confessionals the entire time. And we don't even know on the show why he was targeted here, where again, clearly they thought it was more important to be getting rid of him than it was to be getting rid of Amy's idol, as why else would they split it this way? But again, we just don't know why that's the case. So again, I think that's poor editing there. We do also end up seeing more of Jordan, where he ends up telling Amy to play her idol. Again, making it very clear to her that people know about her idol. So again, I really don't get why she was so passive with the use of her idol in this round. And to be honest, I wouldn't be surprised if this all stems from the advice that Sandra gave earlier in the season, where she tells everyone to keep their idol secret. Which, again, I think this is completely unintentional. Where, outside of building up this persona of being this mentor figure, I do think this is actually poor play to tell everyone to keep their idols a secret, as wouldn't you want everyone to tell you that they have idols? But I do think this is what leads to Amy trying to keep her idol secret all the way up until Tribal, where it's not until Sandra directly tells her to play it that she ends up revealing to everyone that she has it. But again, the votes do come in on Jay, and the show really tries to portray this as massive blindside, but I just really found it dull. Again, I already suspected that Jay was going home, as I wouldn't put it past Australian Survivor to give him no confessionals. And the fact that they blatantly outlined this plan to get rid of him made it pretty clear he was getting voted out here, but also, who cares about this blindside when it's happening to Jay, this person that they don't even bother to show on their show? And really, that just sums up my thoughts on Jay. It's he was there. Again, they didn't give him any screen time outside of him talking about Alex during mat chats, and we saw a bit of his relationship with Amy here, but again, we barely heard him talk, and this is really just egregious editing from Australian Survivor's end. But again, so bad to the point where I didn't put it past them to actually do this, where again, he just didn't seem to be that important to the storyline, especially with his loved one quitting in the previous episode. And also with his loved one being his now ex-girlfriend's brother, which was just bizarre. And really, I don't even get why they ended up casting them if they weren't going to use their connection to Sam Frost as a thing to bring up on their show, which again just ends up never being brought up throughout the season. Now for episode 7, which was promoted beforehand as the best episode ever. And I did feel there were so many possibilities here, considering we do end up getting a swap. And I felt like it could have been because of the crazy vote, but instead I just really found this episode really underwhelming. Now we do start it with Nina getting to talk about how much she loves her tribe, which clearly made her the main character of this episode here, as that's pretty much all we get here before the swap. Now, as for the swap itself, due to us swapping with odd numbers, one person ends up not getting a buff, and that person ends up being Mark. And he ends up getting a decision on which tribe to go to, which I felt was a really interesting way to deal with the uneven numbers here. Again, in a season with loved ones being involved, him essentially getting the choice of which tribe to go to did lead to an interesting dilemma here. Him having the choice between this tribe that has more of his former tribe, or him going to a tribe where he would technically be down numbers, but he would have his wife. And he does end up picking his alliance here first, which initially the edit does portray here as the wrong move, with Sam being upset that they don't get to play together here, and his tribe end up losing the reward as well. But interestingly, we later get Sam talking about the move once again, but that time being supportive of his decision, saying that the last time that they played, they were targeted as a duo, and this obviously avoids that situation. And this style of editing of showing a move made by Mark that is initially seen as controversial, but it later getting rectified by Sam, where she eventually talks about the merits of it, which again led into me thinking that Mark is the clear frontrunner here. Now on the Water Tribe, the Old Blood Tribe have the numbers, though that never really seemed to matter, considering how every vote off from this point forward, until the merge, ends up being a person coming from the original Blood Tribe. Now here we do see Sam and Sophie back on the same tribe, and that makes Sophie an easy target here. The rest of the tribe's content revolves around Chrissy finding an idol clue at the reward, leading to Croc finding the idol, and we get a lot of talk about them using this idol to get to the merge, which ends up being kind of ironic. But the new Blood Tribe gets all of the focus here, where we do end up having the core majority from the original Water Tribe sticking together here, with Mark, Jordy, Josh, and Nina still being aligned, and Josh also being reunited with Jordan here. And this group clearly becomes the majority of this tribe. All while Sandra ends up getting what is probably her worst case scenario here of being swapped in the minority with her daughter on her tribe, which increases the target on her back, and without any of her former allies. And really the people that she ends up with are people that actively want to target her, in Dave and Amy. So she was pretty screwed here, but initially the target doesn't seem to land on her. And Jordy ends up getting this massive visibility spike here, with him getting most of the credit for the eventual move. Now along the way, we do get a lot of content from Nina as well, with her talking about the struggles of playing with Sandra here. And while Mel does initially get set up as a target, we do end up seeing Mark and Jordy agree on taking out Sandra instead, but they don't seem to tell Nina about the plan before Tribal, but she clearly picks up on the plan along the way. And again, we get this basic Sandra vote off here as the main plan, but considering how hyped up this episode was beforehand, I was like, this surely can't be it, right? There has to be something more interesting going on here. And right after that, we do get the mention of Shay's idol and the possibility of her playing it on Sandra. And this felt like something of the caliber of a move that would warrant the hype here, but it really ends up going nowhere, where this never really felt like a realistic possibility. And coming into Tribal, it seemed pretty clear that everyone knew that Sandra was getting voted out here, even Sandra, where Jordy doesn't even try to hide his plan anymore. And we get to the votes where Nina votes for Sandra as well. Again, getting another player to vote out their mom, which was just like the Sierra situation, where she's really just latching on to a plan that was already made and her vote actually doesn't matter here. But along the way, we do also end up having Shay play her idol for herself for seemingly no reason. Now, again, I get her thought of, okay, the idol puts a target on my back and she wanted to show trust to her tribe here, but considering she ends up clearly being on the bottom of her tribe moving forward, I mean, this did seem like a waste of a play here. And we do end up with a unanimous vote against Sandra here, which does end up continuing this day 16 curse. But really outside of that, I just felt like this was a really underwhelming episode that had been so hyped up beforehand and really just did not live to that to me. And with that, let's talk about Sandra, who's obviously one of the stars of the pre-merge here, with her having by far the most confessionals up until this point. But it really felt like we saw more of the same from Sandra here. And most of her confessionals revolved around her being the queen. She ends up playing in a similar way to how she approached her first few seasons, with her trying to be a bit more under the radar. We saw her play with the same level of target that she had in Game Changers and Winners at War, and obviously ends up going out in a similar way as her previous attempts, where she goes out the first tribal she attends after a swap, which I feel like is always a danger spot for Sandra at this point, where on her initial tribe, she's able to build one-on-one bonds there and also has such a big target on her back that in the current meta of Meat Shield, she is the perfect person to keep around as a target for you. And being this massive threat in the game that will be targeted, but not one that is unbeatable in the end, in the sense that she's rarely going to win challenges to the point that you could probably just vote her out at some point towards the end game. However, with swaps being in place and her not being on a swap tribe with the people that she initially bonded with, she's pretty much screwed due to the fact that she obviously lacks social bonds with those people, and now her threat level completely turns on her to where she isn't an effective meat shield for those specific people, and in turn is just outright a threat and will be taken out immediately afterwards. And really, I feel like, again, that is the trajectory for Sandra in really most of these big names in Survivor, these figures like a Boston Rob or a Parvati on most given appearances at this point. But with that, let's move on to episode 8, which was a shorter episode, and due to that, we only get one scene at the Blood Tribe, which really just showed us the ramifications of the Sandra boot, where Jordy declares himself the Joker, which really just felt like a name the producers were trying to force in there for marketing reasons. But The immunity challenge ends up being a redo of a challenge from AU 2017, where the tribes have to hold up a disc, which Mark had won for his tribe last time, and they win once again here. But interestingly, after the challenge, we do have the family members talk to each other, with Mark and Sam confirming the plan to take out Sophie, which ends up being pretty straightforward here. Now we do get Sophie campaigning here, with her trying to make a deal with Sam, where they would work both sides, and that would have been pretty cool if they had been able to execute it, but really the trust was already gone at this point. We do also see Sophie targeting Khan due to his idol once again, which again makes him a secondary target here when they had already spoiled that he was going to make the merge. But again, there was no real intrigue here, with Sophie being the clear boot, where the main level of intrigue here really comes from all this confusion over the split vote plan. I mean, because that's Australian Survivor for you. But Croc is the one that's shown as leading the split vote here, with him explicitly telling KJ that she's going to get some votes on her. And obviously through this episode, we do also get the return of the KJ-Sophie relationship, with KJ still being annoyed that Sophie is putting a target on her back, and made it pretty clear coming into Tribal that KJ was going to be voting for Sophie, which makes it 2 episodes in a row of a loved one voting out another. But again, it was more so piling on, where Sophie was already going home here. But with that, let's talk about Sophie, who, again, I didn't love her actions outside the show, with her treatment of Sam and also making claims that the game was rigged against her. But as a character, I mean, she's incredible here. She is such a fun villain, but also one that is seemingly willing to play the game. I mean, yes, she does take things very personally, but we also do see her have a decent strategic mind throughout the season. And we see her be part of this initial core on Blood. She does try to play out of the bottom, trying to make deals with Khan and Sam. I mean, the Sam move is even more impressive considering she's able to put her feelings aside. So, I mean, like, I do see her as someone that came there to play, and she did have a notable rivalry with Sam here, and really, had it not been for the outside circumstances of her ruining her relationship with production, I feel like she would have been someone that I would love to have seen back, and someone I would have fully expected to see back down the road. But now let's move on to episode 9, where we obviously see the ramifications of the Sophie vote, which I do think leads to some strong content for KJ in setting up a storyline that she's now playing for the both of them, which did end up rising her slightly in winner contention, though again, this is episode 9 that this content finally shows up, which is a bit late. But here we also get a lot of Khan content, with his relationship with Sam getting established here, and also just kind of out of nowhere, we get this content about how Ben is annoying his tribe with his constant frustrations over his challenge performance. And yes, Ben does end up winning the immunity challenge for them at the end of the episode, but it really did make me think that Ben was not long for the game at this point. On the Blood Tribe, Amy did get a lot of content from the offset, with her talking about being on the bottom, and we do see her relation with Jordan, only for her to directly target Jordan due to his challenge performance, which, I mean, I get that Jordan here is obviously an easier person to pin the votes on, as the person that just messed up in the last immunity challenge, and he alongside her is coming from the minority tribe and also has his cousin on this tribe. So again, like, I get why she targets him, but this did seem like a very rash move that ends up burning her relationship with him in a position where he had a semblance of power here, due to him being there with Josh, which, by the way, Josh finally gets content here for pretty much the first time, again in episode 9 here, which is insane, considering how clear it was that Josh was a big player out there, and he plays a big role moving forward. But here we see him clearly having this strong relationship with Nina and Shay, to the point where Nina talks about being okay with being Josh's number 2 for now. But here, initially, the plan does seem to be for Mel to be the target. Again, this person who we've never seen on the show up until this point. So obviously, Amy's plan to turn the votes on Jordan here was going to end up backfiring on her. But the edit does make it seem like the swing votes here are Nina and Shay. But we do instantly see Shay tell Josh about the plan, which really ends up solidifying the votes on Amy. Though I'll be honest, I actually did think Jordan could have been the boot here, considering I at least saw some potential storylines of Amy moving forward, where again, she still had this talk about wanting to get out of Khan's shadow, while Jordan simply didn't have a storyline. Also got sufficient negative content here to warrant a boot. So again, I did feel like there was a chance Jordan went home here, but obviously it does end up being an Amy boot instead. And I mean, I really liked Amy on the show. I mean, she seemed like the typical, like, earlier boot that demonstrated a decent amount of potential, with her being a really strategically active player here, though again seemed to be one that made some questionable decisions at points where she did seem to be actively ruining her game through her targeting Jordan, where she wasn't the initial target here. But I do think she is someone that is primed for a return, where I do think she is someone that would have a lot of potential had she been able to make the merge. Now for episode 10, which does end up being a non-elim vote-wise, though obviously we do end up losing Nina anyway. But before that, the Blood Tribes content does spend some time propping Nina up with her getting to outline her strategy of wanting to work with the guys. And we do see the guys wanting to target Shay, only for Nina to seemingly talk them out of it and get them to target Mel, which again to me felt like a very forced scene considering we had already seen the guys wanting to target Mel in the past. So to see the edit talk about all this work Nina is putting in here to get them to target Mel, a person they've already been targeting for a while, did seem ridiculous. But really from this point forward, both Ben and Shay end up being looked at as massive targets, with this looming merge obviously playing a factor in that. But as I said, it does all lead up to the Nina medevac, where she does get injured during the reward challenge, but even then, she doesn't technically get taken away until the actual reward itself, during which we do have Mark finding a clue to an idol, thinking that no one saw it, but then we get the reveal that Jordy did. And this really sets up the Mark-Jordy rivalry that does become prominent in the post-merge, but overall was a bad look for Mark here, with the edit undercutting him, through him, again, truly believing that he got away with this, which ends up being a pretty major chink in Mark's edit here. But we do get to the immunity challenge, where bizarrely they bring Nina in a car that drives up to the immunity challenge, which was very jarring. And we do get the reveal that she's on crutches. So she ends up returning to the mat just for JLP to tell her, you've been medevaced from the game, which was very awkward and obviously a scene put together for TV here. Like, it really just felt like a formality just to confirm that she's out of the game. So because I found this scene to be kind of weird too, but obviously emotional, and you got to feel for Nina here. I mean, she was in a great spot in the game, seeming to be the one woman that was able to penetrate the all-guy core alliance. And while that might have just been the editing and them wanting to prop her up before she went out here, and maybe she wasn't as well insulated as the show portrayed, I mean, I do feel like she did some pretty good work across the season, and seeing her go out unceremoniously here was underwhelming, especially considering how much hype there was for her coming into the season, and how much she ended up living up to it. And to me, she did play better than I expected her to, and I do fully anticipate seeing her play again, considering how blatant production was in wanting her back, with JLP even saying that she's coming back in the episode. So again, I don't expect this to be the end of her story. But with that, we're not done with the episode just yet, as we do have to talk about the Water Tribe, which does end up losing the immunity challenge and have to go to Tribal here, but with the announcement that the winning tribe gets an advantage in the game, it did seem pretty clear from the offset that this was going to be a non-elim, which I think was a last second change here due to the Nina boot, because if Nina doesn't go home here and they still had a non-elim, assuming the schedule stays the same outside this round, that would mean that they plan to merge at 14, which I just think is very unlikely. So I do suspect that this was a twist that they threw in at the last second here. But as for the dynamics on Water, it really does end up going the way I expected it to, based on that Ben foreshadowing earlier, where here we see Jesse really rise as this massive player, with him getting all the credit in this episode for the eventual Ben boot. Now along the way we do get the typical trying to flush Khan's idol, which obviously wasn't going to happen. And when you get some drama, I guess, from Croc not wanting to vote out Ben, despite his core alliance wanting him to, and we have Croc doing this half measure here of knowing about the Ben boot and not telling him about it, but also deciding to not actually vote for him, which really doesn't gain him any favors from anyone. And I do feel like with the knowledge of this being a non-elim, this does end up being a detrimental move for him, with it definitely playing a factor in the next round, playing into why Ben can't trust Croc. Jesse is shown to be the mastermind of this, and I was hesitant of it being the correct move at this point. I mean, again, while on paper, I think getting rid of Ben before the merge is the correct move. I mean, to do so in a round where you know it's going to be a non-elim is definitely not ideal, but considering the plan was probably already in action before the challenge, it would have been a half measure to not go through with it, as at that point you're just risking that vote off someone else, and also Ben could also learn about the plan anyway. So again, like, I get why the plan goes through here. But Ben gets voted out here with 2 votes on Khan, and out of nowhere, KJ gets a vote on her. And this is where we get the reveal that the other tribe gets to steal a player from their tribe, but only one that got votes at Tribal, which is a twist I do actually really like. I mean, as far as non-elims go, I do feel like this one is pretty balanced, where more than likely the people that are getting votes are people that are in danger, so you are potentially saving someone on the bottom. And also, it doesn't make this an overpowered twist by allowing you to take the strongest member of the opposite tribe in the way that we saw happen to Sean back in 2019. But also, you having to work around these blood versus water dynamics here was also interesting to see, with Shay wanting everyone to vote Ben, but the rest of the tribe votes KJ as the least threatening. So again, I did really like this change to the typical player stealing twist here. But now for episode 11, which was probably one of the better episodes of the post-swap. Now, the Blood Tribe doesn't get much content outside of Shay now being on the outs and being upset that her tribe didn't steal Ben. Also, we do have KJ talking about needing to join the boys club to stay in the game. And I guess we might as well just talk about this now. This all-guys group that ends up running the tribe and also ends up being part of the initial alliance after the merge. This obviously did upset a lot of people out there, talking about this was just a toxic masculinity. And I get the sentiment, but I will also say there is definitely merit to this alliance here. Again, this is Australian Survivor, a game where the meta is that these big guys are going to get targeted at the merge and go out one by one by one. And the show even refers to that earlier in the season. So, I mean, I do think it is optimal strategy for these big guys to be sticking together, using each other as meat shields. And while, yes, it can feel icky at points, I don't think you can really fault them as players for thinking that this is the best way for them to navigate the game. But again, most of this episode does focus around the Water Tribe, with us starting with this Ben-Chrissy rivalry, with Ben seeming to put a lot of the blame on his vote off on Chrissy, which did feel like her falling into this stigma against older women that play the mom archetype, as, I mean, clearly there are other players that were more integral to this vote than Chrissy. But right away, again, Ben seems to be clearly targeting her at this point. Seems to be the most hurt by her. But either way, I mean, Ben is the clear target here, to the point where the tribe actually ends up even throwing the immunity challenge to try to vote him out. And everything seems to be going according to plan until Croc decides to make his move, where despite the numbers being pretty much the same as the last round, he decides now is the time to actually save Ben and create this plot to blindside Jesse, which is a solid move on paper. Again, we do see that Jesse is this really strong player, but here he proves to be too strong of a player, to where this plan completely backfires on Croc, with literally no one being on board, not even his own loved one in Chrissy. And this did add a fascinating element of this vote here, where we do see, for the first time in a Blood vs. Water season, loved ones actively working against each other. I mean, yes, we've seen family members vote each other out, but those were in situations where the loved ones were already going home. So for Chrissy here to actively be working against Croc's plan was interesting to see, especially considering it was all to save Jesse, someone that she eventually votes off later. Now, obviously, I think the Croc plays into why she votes him out later, but still, it does make it seem kind of ridiculous. And from a game standpoint, I do find Chrissy's decision here very questionable, as I do feel like she probably should have sided with Croc. But even Ben, the person Croc was trying to save here, doesn't even go along with the plan. Now again, the previous vote definitely played a factor here, as how do you trust that this plan is genuine when Croc was willing to let you go in the previous round? And while what Ben does here does end up keeping him around for one more round, I do also feel like his optimal move would have been to work with Croc here. Though obviously, again, I get why he doesn't. But instead, he ends up using this info of the Jesse blindside in order to gain trust with Jesse and Sam, and they end up flipping the votes onto Croc. Really, to me, it felt pretty blatant that Croc was going home here, and he does end up getting blindside with the idol in his pocket. And through that, we learn about this rule change from last season where idols can't be handed off after vote-offs anymore, which I think is definitely for the better. And really, this entire scene of Croc's vote-off ends up being a pretty emotional exit for him, with Chrissy seeming to be devastated, with her being partially responsible for the plan not going through here. But with that, let's talk about Croc, who I will say I was pretty disappointed by over the course of this season, where I really felt like he could have been like the second coming of like a Matt Rogers, with him seeming primed to be this big player that was a big fan of the show, but also one that could hide behind this concept of mateship that would allow him to still keep his power structure for a lot of it. But instead, he never really seemed to be that well positioned in the game. He never really seemed to have that great of a grasp on the dynamics in the game. I mean, he was outside of the core majority for a lot of it. He tries to save Ben, ends up ruining his game through doing so. And also from a character standpoint, I just feel like he didn't bring much to the table, despite him being one of the more advertised players on the cast here. So again, as a whole, I did feel pretty underwhelmed by his run. Now for episode 12, the final pre-merge episode, which again, pretty much goes as I expected it to, where I did feel like Ben was a goner coming into the episode. And that ends up being the case, but not exactly in the way that I expected it to happen, because we do end up getting the redo of the twist, where both tribes vote someone out, and the two voted out compete in a fire-making challenge to return. But along the way, we do also have an immunity challenge, where one person from each tribe wins immunity, and we do get some intrigue from both results here, where Shay is propped up as the big target for the Blood tribe, only for her to win immunity here, while for the Water tribe, we do end up having Khan win immunity, but along the way, he makes a deal with Sam to give her that immunity if she drops, she eventually ends up doing, which I do think is 100% the correct move to make here, as it does gain him some trust with Sam, while also giving him implicit immunity here for at least a singular round, as this would have obviously been a terrible look for Sam to vote out Khan after she had just done this in front of the entire cast. But also, it would have been a terrible move for Khan to not go through this plan as well, as it also would have ruined his reputation to not hand over the necklace. So I did find this to be an interesting scenario where the optimal move is to give away your immunity. But as for the votes on Blood Tribe, again, Shay was the initial target, but with her being safe, they do try to pretend like Mark could be the target here, with him finally finding the idol, but Jordy ends up seeing him do so, leading to Mark once again getting undermined in the edit, which was abnormal here, with him talking about no one knowing again, only for him to admit to Jordy later that he does have it. And he talks about trusting Jordy, only for Jordy to talk about him holding the power around Mark's future, and ends up calling Mark an idiot, which again is a bad look for Mark. Though interestingly, after a challenge, this target that is supposedly on Mark's back is never mentioned again. Instead, Jordy narrates the return to camp, talking about how the vote is obviously between Mel and KJ, which felt like a bit of redemption for Mark's edit there. But the vote itself was pretty mundane, where KJ does get content around her trying to get back in the guy's good graces, and it does seem to be effective enough to where Mel is eventually voted out here. Again, a person that had zero confessionals up until this point. Though interestingly, again, Mark is propped up here as the swing vote for no reason here, which again felt like the edit was redeeming him for that negativity that was given to him earlier. As for the Water tribe, I mean, I always thought Ben was going home here, especially once the Ben versus Chrissy storyline became the focus again, in a situation where I was pretty confident Chrissy was not going home. And we do once again have Ben trying to split the vote on Khan, but it was never going through, especially with Sam being indebted to him here, and with Ben's move to take out Croc not really getting him any social capital. I just felt like there was no room to maneuver here, and he does end up losing the fire making challenge against Mel, which I also just found really boring considering how convinced I was of the result here. But let's talk about Ben, who was an interesting player on this season. Again, kind of like Croc, in the sense that had a really flawed game even from the beginning, being on the outs at points, but also seems to be a competent strategic thinker, but just from looking at him comes off as this really overt threat. And in a season like this where all the big guys come together, and for them to not even consider adding Ben as part of their group, that really does make me think that Ben is probably just never going to do that well in Australian Survivor, considering I feel like this was probably one of his better case scenarios. But also from a character standpoint, I didn't find him that interesting either, to where I know a lot of people talk about him making the merge would have shaken things up and it would have been more interesting, but I mean, really, I think it would have been more of the same. It's just that he would have been booted at the first opportunity, and I don't think there's much he could have really done. But with that, let's move on to the merge episode, which for the most part was pretty underwhelming. And really, this is where I feel like the general consensus really starts to turn more negative on the season. Though, for me, I was already on that trajectory for a while, but I feel like people had such a negative reaction after these next few episodes that I was actually probably more positive on the season than most people by that point. But we do start the episode, interestingly to me, with a bit of focus on Jordy, with him talking about how excited he is to play with Jesse, and the fact that his edit really skyrockets at this point and he becomes a focal character after the merge here, with him even narrating like the merge feast. It really did shoot him back into winner contention for me, though realistically I did also feel like this edit could be very similar to that of a Benji, the edit of someone that is a big player and is a likable underdog, but one that doesn't quite make it to the end. We obviously get to the merge itself, and right away, Mel gets her first confessional, again in episode 13, and we follow this with the twins getting their intro, again in episode 13. But after that, we get to the reward challenge, where the reward is $5,000 a month for a year, which is insane. I mean, that is $60,000 for one singular challenge here. Again, in a game where there is no prize money for second place. You get the same stipend as every other jury member. It is insane that Khan, who ends up winning it here, and is also the first juror, ends up winning more money than anyone on this cast outside of the winner, just from winning this one singular competition. But this did also seem to paint a target on his back, with him now winning 2 individual challenges in a row, and with him having a public idol as well. It did seem like he was an easy target here, with his main saving grace being that he was very close to Sam, which obviously doesn't work out, though I feel like a lot of that comes down to the blood versus water theme. And with that, we might as well jump into the main focus of the episode, which is on Mark and Sam. I mean, it essentially turns into the Mark and Sam show at this point, which through that comes some negativity for Mark. Both of them being the focus of the all-important merge episode, it really did solidify their spots as top contenders for me, where right away they get personal content talking about their son, and really a lot of their storyline throughout the season had been leading up to them getting to the merge, with the constant talk around them about how they want to get back together to run the game, and that's kind of what ends up happening here. But it doesn't really play out as smoothly as you would think, and this leads us back to Jordy, where at this point it seems like Mark, Sam, Jesse, Jordy are a very blatant core 4, considering the dynamics coming into the merge. So Jordy and Sam end up talking about their alliance, and this leads to Jordy mentioning Mark's idol, which somehow Mark had never told Sam about, which is insane to me that this happened. I mean, like, I get Mark wanting to lessen the number of people that know about it to stop the spread of the info about it, but, I mean, this is your wife. I mean, the mother of your child. And for you to not even tell her about this idol and simply not trust her with this information is insane to me. But once again, the edit does go out of its way to rationalize it here, with us getting a confessional from Sam talking about how this is actually a good thing, because now Jordy thinks that Mark is more loyal to him, and now they won't think of us as this strong power duo, which again really felt like them going out of their way to prop up Mark here. We do also see the initial core alliance here of essentially all the remaining pairs left in the game except for the twins, and they end up having 2 initial targets here in Shay and Khan, with this being a major source of conflict between Mark and Sam, with Sam wanting to target Shay and Mark wanting to target Khan, which brings back the storyline all the way back from the beginning of the season, where Mark just seems to have tunnel vision on Khan in a way that is also just a bad look. Now again, this could just be the editing of Mark getting all the content around him targeting Khan to give him credit for the Khan boot, when in reality, I assume it's all the guys that wanted this to happen. But considering this conflict between Mark and Sam over who to target, the fact that Mark seemed irresponsive to Sam's compromise in voting out Shay, especially when Khan is someone that is in Sam's corner, while Shay doesn't have a strong connection to any of them, it did feel very icky to see like a husband here dismiss his wife and not even bothering to compromise and not consider her thoughts on the situation. Again, to me, it just was not a good look. Again, I'm not saying that Mark is a bad husband, as I've seen people call him out for online, which is ridiculous. Again, I just feel like the way that he handled this situation, again, a situation within the course of the game, was misguided here, but that doesn't make him a terrible person. But again, I do think game-wise here, Khan did seem to be closer to Mark and Sam than Shay ever did. So if this was me, again, I do think it would have been more beneficial to keep Khan for their individual games, even though I get how Khan would be a big threat to the alliance as a whole. And while this is, again, a bad look for Mark, I do feel like this also starts people's frustrations with Sam, with her constant talk about not wanting to be told what to do, and her being perceived to be on the bottom of this all guys group, and people being upset that she's not doing anything about it. But again, I think this is just a weird circumstance, with this being a blood versus water season, with her being there with Mark, her husband, in a position where they share whatever prize they get. And while I am sure that there is a bit of competitive nature between them, where I'm sure they think it would be cool if they beat their spouse, I mean, there really is no incentive for them to be working separately here. Especially when Mark has more of his numbers coming into the merge here, and for Sam to actively be going out of her way to ruin Mark's game is something that I think would be tough to live with, and something that I just find very tough to believe that any spouse would actually do. So while a lot of people start to criticize Sam at this point in the game, I really don't have any issues with what she does here. Like, I know people want her to go and tell Khan to use the idol, but to me that just seemed too dangerous of a play here, with the word of this potentially getting back to the majority, and at that point both Mark and Sam's games are ruined. So again, I get why Khan gets voted out here. That being said, I do think a thing that isn't mentioned as much is how much of a blown opportunity this is for the people not in that core alliance, particularly people like a Michelle or a Mel or a KJ or a Shay, these people that are easy targets moving forward, where through their votes and Khan's idol, they could have easily pulled off a massive move here, but instead they are all targeting each other, which I do think you have to credit the majority alliance for keeping the minority in line here, but this did lead to an underwhelming result. Though interestingly, Khan does end up being the first jury member here at 13, making this the biggest jury for Australian Survivor up until this point. But with that, let's talk about Khan, who I thought was a pretty fun presence across the season, but also one that I wish got more to do here. I mean, despite him being one of the top confessional getters by time of his boot, I felt like most of his content was pretty one note, revolving around either his idol or how he was King Khan or how he was a cook. I feel like a lot of his actual gameplay across the season wasn't really shown to us in favor of these other not as interesting storylines, with a lot of his content being people telling us how big of a threat he is without us actually seeing why that is truly the case. But again, he did have a fun energy to him and was one of the more promoted players across the season, to where I do expect to see him again down the road. Now for episode 14, which continues more of the same storylines from the last episode in the first half of it. Mark and Sam immediately reconcile, and Mark really gloats about the Khan boot, which did make him seem a bit overconfident here, with him talking about being a lock for the end game, only for us to eventually get to Jordy exposing Mark's idol to Josh and Jordan, which on paper you would think, oh, this is going to blow up Mark's spot and make him an easy target, with Jordy now talking about blindsiding him with the idol. But this bizarrely ends up backfiring on Jordy instead, with Josh thinking that he's a loose cannon because of this move, instead considering targeting him instead. And really, this entire subplot around Mark's idol and Jordy targeting him just really felt out of place, considering how despite Jordy trying to blow up Mark's spot here, he does continue to vote with Mark, up until the point where Mark flips on him first. Now we do also see Sam still wanting to target Shay and really making it clear to Shay that she's on the bottom, and really the actions of the majority alliance here did feel very questionable, with them all not really hiding that they're together, again, at the final 12. But as expected, Shay does win immunity here, shifting the core 6 against the twins, with the plan now to split the vote between them and to get Mel out, which I get as they are the only pair left not in the alliance, and they also have the least amount of connections to the people within the alliance. Though again, for these two who have gotten no content up until the merge, it is funny to hear about how big of threats they are at this point. Afterwards, we do see more of Sam being skeptical of the boys, thinking that Mark is being blinded by a bromance, and we see her trying to flip Mark on Josh, and he tells him that it's not the right time, which at the time did feel a bit questionable, but considering how Josh and Jordan do end up siding with Mark and Sam moving forward, it does probably end up being the right call here. But this is where Josh gets back on the show, with him being touted as this mastermind, with him articulating the strategy of keeping the threats around and taking out all the floaters. But again, all of this felt very jarring considering he's barely been on the show. You then see him create the split vote, which I will say was very well constructed here, where eventually we do see the women consider trying to come together to put the votes on Josh, but the way that the votes were split here are in a way that if the 5 women that are not in the core alliance here come together, it's simply not enough to ruin the split. It becomes a 5-5-2 vote, to where obviously they would just save Josh on the revote. So considering how the votes were split here, that minority group would always need to flip one of Sam or David. Sam, who is again playing with her husband and again would struggle to flip against him, and also David, this guy who's been working alongside all these guys since the swap and seemed to have a close relationship with Josh and Jordan. And this is even in the scenario where we're thinking that Chrissy is going to flip on Josh, which I don't think was happening here anyway. So again, Mel and Michelle were never going to get any traction here, and again, they should have made the move the previous round instead of targeting Khan. But really, I just didn't feel like Mel had much of a chance here. And even she made it clear that she was going home by the time she ends up voting. And even like Michelle doesn't even vote with her, voting for Jordy instead, which comes out of nowhere. So again, there wasn't much suspense there. But with that, let's talk about Mel, who obviously gets no content up until the merge. And in her last 2 episodes here, does come off as a bit more of a focal character. And while I don't agree with the purpling, especially to this degree, for anybody, I do get why out of everyone on this cast, like Mel and Michelle are the ones that get no content here, as they didn't seem to be that important to the story, didn't seem to have any solid allegiances out there to where everyone was just okay with them going home. Now for Mel here, I mean, at least she was the bigger fan of the two. And obviously as a fan, it does suck to eventually get on your favorite show and then you just not make most of the edit. But to be honest, like I think from what we did see within the game, it just seems like she doesn't have that much potential in the game. And didn't seem to be that interesting on screen while she was there. Now for episode 15, which ends up being one of the better episodes of the season and really a bright spot in what is a pretty boring stretch in the post-merge. But right away we do see Josh finally using the info about Mark's idol against Jordy here, with him telling Mark and Sam about Jordy's move, and in turn creates a new power structure that ends up holding strong moving forward, that essentially replaces Jordy and Jesse with Chrissy and Dave, who out of nowhere are talked about on the show as being like very, very close to Josh, which did feel ridiculous considering, again, Josh has barely gotten any content so far. David hasn't gotten any content since episode 3. And Chrissy has never even talked on the show about her relationship with Josh until this point. So this did feel very jarring, but it also is not lost on me that these 2 singles that get added to this alliance here are the 2 people that know nothing about Survivor coming into the season. And the people that really just came out play this season because of their loved ones. So again, this is just an issue I have with the casting of Blood vs. Water seasons, to where the 2 that didn't know what they were doing coming into the season end up happily joining onto the bottom of this new majority group, and through that help the season stay mundane moving forward. But through the creation of this alliance, Jordy is now the biggest target on the board, but we do get this dilemma from Sam, who doesn't want to turn on Jesse, but kind of has to after having seen how Jordy threw Mark under the bus, which is an interesting dynamic stemming from this Blood vs. Water theme here, where the conflict here is based around both of their loved ones. Well, Sam and Jesse are really close here, but Sam has to turn on Jesse in order to keep Mark safe, and in turn has to lose her next closest ally after Mark. But interestingly, at the same time, Jordy and Jesse here are also planning on flipping the game here, but not on Mark as you would think it would be, but instead on Josh, with KJ and Michelle also joining their side, which ends up perfectly setting Mark and Sam here as these swing votes that both sides are really solidified in thinking that they have. We do also have a really interesting reward that Chrissy and Jordy win, but we do have a lot of searching for idol clues, with Josh and Mark trying to keep it out of Jordy's hands, only for Jordy to find it in his towel. And we have this like heist scene of them trying to pass it off to Jesse, and we have Mark like testing Jordy in order to see if he's going to lie about the clue, and Mark picks up on the fact that he does, which makes him a clear target. But again, as you would expect, Jordy wins immunity, which even coming into this episode, I was fully expecting this to happen, considering the commercials showed this confessional from Mark of him saying Jesse's going to pay for Jordy's mistakes, which makes no sense for him to say that unless this exact scenario played out. And we do see Jesse being the main target after a challenge here, and if this had just been a streamlined Jesse vote, flip of the power structure, but nothing too major, this would have been a mostly mundane round outside of the dilemma for Sam. But again, she was obviously going to side with Mark. But really the main source of intrigue for this episode comes from the idol hunt, where Jesse goes looking for an idol right before Tribal and ends up finding it, but Sam walks in on him, and I was thinking, okay, Sam knows he has an idol now, so she's probably going to feel more incentivized to vote him out with the idol in his pocket, not even thinking about what happens afterwards, where Jesse hands Sam the idol to hide it, which through doing so even further incentivizes her to vote out Jesse now, with her getting to keep the idol. And this is a really cold-blooded move, and one that did end up being pretty controversial. I mean, like in terms of how to navigate through the game, this move is very solid. I mean, while Sam is sacrificing a really tight ally in Jesse, Jesse also has Jordy, who he's obviously going to be more loyal to at the end of the day. And through voting Jesse out, he does gain the trust of Josh and Jordan, while also gaining an idol that theoretically no one knows about. So again, I think all of that is very strong. However, in terms of perception from the jury, I do think this potentially burns not only Jesse's jury vote from executing the move on him, but also the votes of these other players that aren't so strategically minded and that do think about the game under the concepts of mateship and loyalty. And through that, this style of move could definitely lose her respect from those style of jurors. But really, at the end of the day, I still lean towards this as a pretty optimal move, but one that does have some pretty blatant negatives to it, and it makes it so that her and Mark have 2 idols here at the time of the final 10, while also being part of a solid core majority. And again, considering the blood versus water theme here, this does also greatly improve Mark's position in the game as well. So again, I do stand by her move here, even though on paper, again, like I think siding with Josh and Jordan can also be a bit dangerous considering how strong a bonds they have to Chrissy and David. But I mean, to be fair, also Josh and Jordan end up being relatively locked in moving forward. So I do think it ends up playing out pretty optimally for them. Also, before Tribal, we do get a bevy of confessionals from Jordy talking about how everything is working perfectly, everything is going right for him, and I'll be honest, I did kind of feel bad for him at this point, knowing that his entire game's going to be flipped on him, and Jesse's going to go home with his enemy now having the idol that he found the clue for. And obviously we do get the Tribal where Jesse is voted out with Sam getting to keep the idol, which again, technically rules-wise, I do think this is a bit wonky. Now, in the US, I don't think this would have worked, as Jesse never gave ownership to the idol to Sam. He only gives her the idol to hold on to it, which in the US would still quantify this as Jesse's idol. Not saying that if a situation like this happened in the US that the producers wouldn't let it slide because it makes good TV, but again, I am unsure of whether or not this was in the Australian rules, considering, I mean, they obviously change their rules all the time. But what made this an even more memorable moment here was seeing Jesse whisper to Sam immediately after the vote off that he can blow up her game right there. And this was a pretty surreal scene to see. I mean, while we have seen people just outright leak information in order to ruin other people's games on the way out, we haven't seen someone literally threaten them on the way out. So I did find this to be a pretty tense scene. And we do also have Jesse telling Jordy about the idol as well, which really propels Jordy's underdog arc moving forward. But with that, let's talk about Jesse, who, despite being extremely young here, also comes off as one of the better strategic minds across this season. And his power duo with Sam throughout the pre-merge was really interesting to see, and really ends up being one of the more interesting non-loved one dynamics here. And despite his move to give Sam the idol is one that is looked at as a really dumb move, I at least understand the rationale for him doing so, and it's not like it made no sense for him to do so, to where I do think if Jesse were to ever come back, I think he would be a very dangerous player, with him already being a pretty competent player despite how young he is. Now let's jump into episode 16, which starts off the Purgatory twist, which was this season's version of Redemption Rock. Again, a style of twist that they have almost every season. But this one ends up really dragging out for us, where we have 4 vote-offs before the people return, and then 3 of those 4 people come back, which is just really ridiculous, and makes these rounds feel really redundant, especially considering the Majority Alliance sticks together through all of these rounds, though in comparison to something like the Urn twist that happened in a similar spot in the season last season, I guess it's better than that, because at least these vote-offs do have a level of significance to them, unlike the Urn twist where it literally just nullifies the entire vote. But really, this entire episode ends up revolving around Jordy now being this massive underdog in the game and him trying to scrape his way through. We do see him talk with Mark and Sam, where they try to make a deal with him to keep him safe and tell them that they're going to use the idol on him if he's in danger, which felt like complete BS, as you would expect. But this does actually seem to hold Jordy off for a bit here, where he doesn't blow up their spot right away. But this does start this storyline of Jordy wanting revenge, with his constant talks about targeting Sam moving forward. But again, they make it really clear that Jordy is going home if he doesn't win immunity, with Josh even outright telling him that he is going home if he doesn't win immunity. And what do you know? Jordy wins immunity. But again, the 6-person alliance here does end up sticking together and votes out their next biggest threat here in Shay. But there is some intrigue along the way, especially with there now being only 2 pairs left in the game, so the singles technically outnumber that core of the 2 pairs, and Jordy tries to get all the singles together, but ultimately fails in doing so, with Dave talking about how he is waiting for the next round to make the move, and he's already hatching a plan, which, spoiler, he doesn't go through with. But it was funny to see Dave finally get content again here after having not had a confessional since episode 3, but this is where Jordy finally decides to leak the info about Sam's idol, telling pretty much the entire tribe, and obviously the show shows this as potentially causing a big swing here, but it seems like in reality, people just didn't believe him and couldn't believe that Jesse would make a move that stupid, which, I mean, poor Jesse. But also, I find it insane that they don't put some credence into this thought, with Mark and Sam seeming like the clear frontrunners in the game at this point, with Mark's idol being a public idol at this point as well. So, like, to not even consider the concept of them having 2 idols here is kind of insane to me. Though, again, for Josh and Jordan, I do get that they do need Mark and Sam at this point as meat shields and also need more pairs in the game. So I don't even think it's actually their optimal move to turn on Mark and Sam at this point, but it's interesting that they just simply don't believe it. But something I did find interesting about this episode is also how the edit starts to dunk on Sam after the Jesse move, with her getting a lot of content with people talking about how paranoid she is. And even Mark talks about how paranoid she is, and also calls her Jesse move a low blow, which again further propped up his edit to me, with it seeming like the editors were trying to separate him from that situation, but also significantly downgrading Sam's chances of winning the game to me. But again, the vote is a clear Shay vote, which was pretty boring, but we do get the reveal that she is going to purgatory. And with that, let's jump into episode 17, which starts with a pretty long segment about Shay on purgatory, which was just really boring. But at least it did give us some personal content for her that made it seem like for sure she was coming back into the game. Jordy continues to get a massive edit here, with him trying to get people to believe about Sam's idol, which we do eventually see Chrissy admit that she does believe him, but wants to play the game loyally, which made it pretty clear that she wasn't going to flip here. Which again, like, as much as Chrissy is a really fun character, I do feel like she really brought little to the game here, and is probably one of the major reasons why the game ends up being as stagnant as it did. Afterwards, we do get a pretty lengthy reward segment where the reward is a car, but not just any car. It's a car that Jordy has supposedly been talking about wanting the entire time he's been out there, which seemed kind of random, but it was heartwarming to see him win the comp here and him being genuinely excited. But the reward itself did feel very bizarre, because it was Jordy getting to pick 3 people to take with him, and he picks Jordan, Dave, and Michelle. Literally the 3 most invisible people in the edit at this point. And during this reward, they get videos from home. And this was just so ridiculous to me that out of nowhere, we're supposed to care about these 3 people that the producers decide to ignore in the edit. But obviously through this, we do get strong content for Jordy, specifically about him talking about the death of his stepmother, while the others were there. I mean, Dave did have his video from Brianna, so I mean, that was funny. But I mean, outside of that, kind of a boring segment. Though through it, the edit does decide to dunk on Sam once again. I mean, earlier she does also get more content about being paranoid, but here we get this confessional from Michelle talking about how Sam crossed ethical lines with the Jesse move, which is again clearly not how they would have typically portrayed their winners. So again, bad luck for Sam there, but we get to the immunity challenge where it comes down to Jordy and Jordan, with Jordy putting a really strong effort but eventually loses. And it was very telling that when Jordan wins here, we have Mark, Josh, and Chrissy all running up to him and celebrating, which made it very clear they were going to stick together and that Jordy had no shot here. Especially considering we also get a lot of talk about how he's the biggest jury threat at this point. So again, felt like a pretty clear boot. But I will say that coming into this episode, I did think that there was actually a chance of a potential Sam boot, considering how much of a negative turn her edit had been taking. Though again, at this point, it seemed kind of hopeless. But we do see a lot of campaigning from Jordy, and I did find it interesting that we get this scene between Jordy and KJ talking about blindsiding Sam, and they talk about how they'll be okay with going home if they did, which felt like foreshadowing. It did make me think that KJ was the clear target immediately after Jordy was booted. And we do see a decent amount of content from Dave, with him clearly being anti-Sam at this point, but again, it doesn't matter. Jordy gets voted out unanimously here, though when the jury comes in without Shay, it does become pretty apparent that it is going to be a non-elim. especially when JLP announces that they're going to vote again instantly after the Jordy vote off, which in Australian Survivor, they're not going to do this style of twist unless you have a chance to come back into the game. Considering how many episodes they have to fill, they can't waste people like this. I felt like it seemed like an easy KJ vote, even though they didn't actually properly set it up in the episode. There was no talk about KJ being next after Jordy, but maybe that was the best they had. And also, I saw people criticize like Josh and Jordan for not making a move here. Like, that's just ridiculous. Again, why make a big move here in a position where you have very little time to organize a vote? But also, there's no incentive to pull off a big move here when the person can just return to the game immediately afterwards. But let's just jump into episode 18, the final episode for the return from Purgatory, where at this point, Michelle is the only person not in the 6-person alliance. And that did make her a pretty easy target here, but we once again get a lot of talk about flushing an idol. This time Mark's idol, because again, Josh doesn't believe Jordy. But along the way, we do have Sam now being worried about people searching her bag. So we do have this little heist segment of Sam transferring her idol into Mark's bag, which to me further cemented my thought that Mark was going to win here. I mean, this time from an in-game standpoint, though, where now even if Sam is booted, Mark will have 2 idols to utilize moving forward, which seems like a very powerful position to be in. But as I said, we do get talk about flushing the idol from Josh and Jordan, who want to do so while also not harming their relationship with Mark and Sam, because they talk about genuinely wanting to work with Mark moving forward, but just want him to be without his idol. And I feel like this felt like a massive half measure to me, and also just never seemed like it was actually going anywhere, considering Mark ends up winning immunity later in this round. And with this clearly being a non-elim, with the person being eliminated having a chance to return, there's literally no incentive to play an idol this round, where like even if Sam gets voted out here, she's going to have a chance to return and would have a very good chance to return. So again, worse comes to worse, Mark loses Sam but has 2 idols for himself. And again, in almost any other scenario, he gets to keep 2 idols and also Sam. So again, this felt like a pointless plan. But Josh tries to execute it with him telling people on the bottom to vote for Sam so that he doesn't have to vote for Sam to not get the blood on his hands, which again felt very risky for him for very little benefit. And all this knowledge that people are coming back really did seem to stifle the gameplay here, as again, it really gives no incentive to actually make a big move, as why would you make a big move when that person's just going to come back to the game anyway? And also ends up further solidifying this core alliance with constant talk about them needing to stay strong to take out the returnees. But again, for the vote here, it really didn't make any logical sense for it to be Sam, and instead it ends up coming down to Michelle or Dave, who are clearly on the bottom. Though Dave seems like the initial target, and we do have him playing a role in Josh's plan, with him trying to spook Sam into getting the idol played on her, but again, it was never going to work. So we do get the tribal. JLP finally reveals the Purgatory twist, confirming that multiple people will return, which after that, Josh ends up whispering to Mark about switching the plan onto Michelle, which does end up being what happens here, with the split vote plan not even coming through, and ends up just being a unanimous vote. But it's never actually explained why they switched the vote to begin with. I mean, maybe it was to keep Dave closer to their side. Maybe it was to keep Dave in the game, who's someone that's going to be more helpful in taking out Jordy. Maybe it's because Dave is just closer to Josh. But again, it happens here without really any much explanation as to why. But through the votes flipping here, this does end up once again throwing Sam under the bus, with her previously having made a promise to Michelle about how she's never going to vote her out, only for her to do so here, which ends up being pretty poor jury management from her. But then we end the episode with the Purgatory trial, where the 3 people re-enter the game, which to me, I felt like the format of this twist felt like a way to guarantee a Final 3 this season, which Australian Survivor has been trying to have a Final 3 ever since All-Stars, but unexpected exits ruined those plans each of those times. But having 3 people return to the game this late into the game seemed to all but guarantee that we were definitely getting a Final 3 here. Now before the challenge, we do see Jordy solidifying the Purgatory group to work together to try to crack into the majority alliance when they re-enter the game. And really, both Shay and Jordy get strong personal content here as expected, with them seeming to be the only possible, in massive air quotes, winners outside of Mark and Sam at this point. Though I did feel like Michelle clearly got the least amount of content on Purgatory, in that segment that we got right before the challenge, that did make her seem like the clear boot here, and it does come down to her or KJ in what ends up being kind of a boring challenge. But unsurprisingly, Michelle loses here. And Michelle was there. I mean, like Mel, pretty much invisible until the merge. Now, she did technically get to talk about her relationship with Sandra early on, so I mean, that was something. But again, didn't really get any true content until her last few episodes, and really outside the fact that she wasn't a fan like Mel, I couldn't tell you a single difference between the two based on how they were portrayed on the show, and she didn't bring much to the table to me. Now for episode 19, which did feel like a bit of a resurgence entertainment-wise, but one that did feel forced, with it being perpetuated by a twist. Now, the first segment here was pretty boring, with us getting the same, like, Sam versus Jordy storyline, and us seeing the majority being annoyed that the Purgatory players came back into the game. Yet talk about Sam being paranoid again, and all this was pretty boring to me. But eventually we do get to the Survivor auction. And this one was fine. I mean, I did find it interesting to see the majority here try to game it by counterbidding the minority for every covered item. And we do see a lot of people just go straight to 500, with Mark and Jordy going to rocks for what ends up being steak. I mean, like Sam gets toast for $500. And again, all this to lessen the chances that the minority doesn't get some sort of advantage. Cut to KJ getting what ends up being the best item here for $220, where she ends up buying tea that ends up coming with a clue to an advantage that ends up being the one that allows her to send 3 players back to camp at Tribal. Obviously a similar twist to what we have seen with the Safety Without Power, or to George's power from episode 1 of Brains vs. Brawn. And I find this to be very overpowered here, and it's obviously placed in the game at the perfect time for the season. Obviously, it's here to give these 3 Purgatory players the ability to at least tie the votes and have the chance to control the vote simply by flipping over one person, and in the worst case scenario, they go to rocks. This really was the perfect scenario for this advantage, and obviously the producers knew that, and they put it in here to be overpowered. Again, really feeling like it was the producers forcing a really crazy vote here. But I did find it so ridiculous that we get so much screen time for KJ over the course of this episode, where they're talking about how unsure she is if she's going to use the power or not. And it's like, again, this is a clear-cut scenario. The producers are literally like handing you the game. Like, obviously you have to use the power here, but the final item at the auction ends up being Letters from Home, which Shay ends up winning and gets the dilemma of giving up hers to give them to the rest of the tribe. And obviously she does do it, as who wouldn't. But through this, we do get a lengthy segment for Mark and Sam talking about their son. But the more heartwarming moment for me was Josh finding out that his fiancée is pregnant after having started IVF. And again, this was a great moment. I mean, again, for me being this like really cold, cynical bastard, I did find his reaction here pretty touching. And really this episode ends up being a big one for Josh, with him winning immunity and also being set up as a swing vote once again, though really most of the setup to Tribal here is pretty mundane, of just doing the same thing again, with Jordy trying to convince Josh that Mark and Sam have 2 idols. He still doesn't believe it. We do have Dave telling Josh and Jordan that Jordy is right and they have to target Sam, so again, it makes it clear that he's wanting to flip. But interestingly, we do have a conversation between Mark and Sam, with them debating over what to do with the idols, with them agreeing to end up leaving them back at camp. That way, if one of them gets voted out, the silver lining is that the remaining player will have 2 idols for themselves. And as I mentioned in the previous rounds, I do think this is the ideal play for Mark and Sam here, where best case scenario, they're both in the game with 2 idols. Worst case scenario, one of them has 2 idols as they approach the end game. And even then, in this scenario where both of them are vulnerable, there's always the risk of playing an idol on one of them only for the other one to go home. And if that person's someone that is holding an idol as well, they could potentially lose both idols and leave the other person stranded. Again, like, for them, it is better to play it safe and make sure that worst case scenario, one person gets to keep both idols. Now again, this is a bit wonky rules wise, where in the US, this would simply not work. As in the US, leaving your idols back in camp, if you are voted out, you are still technically considered in possession of those idols, and through that, those idols would be nullified moving forward. So had Mark been voted out here, in the US, those idols would be null and void. So again, like, this is a situation that you couldn't do in the US, but considering the rules that they were given, I do think they did the ideal play here. But then we get to Tribal, where KJ plays her advantage and ends up sending Chrissy, Mark, and Josh back to camp, leaving the Purgatory 3 and their swing vote in David to go against Sam and Jordan, who are now on the bottom. And obviously their intent is to flush Sam's idol here. And really, I do think the Purgatory players play this round pretty optimally, considering the fact that they didn't account for Sam not actually having the idol at this point. To which, obviously, if they had known that, obviously you vote out Sam. But I do think Mark and Sam do a pretty effective work here in pretending like Sam has the idol. And some of this does come from a pretty savvy play from Mark on his way out, where despite them not having the idol, he does pass Sam something to make it look like he just handed her it, which does further cement the ideal that Mark only has one idol to those that believe that, as why else would Mark be handing Sam an idol, but also to the people at Tribal, makes it clear to them that Sam is going to use that idol as well. So again, I think this was a pretty strong play for Mark here, and we do get some intrigue from like Sam whispering to others about her having the idol, which I will say, I did feel like this was a bit too obvious. I mean, the edit does prop her up in saying that this is what really saved her, but I feel like this seems super heavy-handed. And had I been in the game at this point, I would have probably decided to go for Sam because of how heavy-handed she is here. That would make me think that she's not actually going to play it. But we get to the vote, and the Purgatory 3 obviously ends up flipping over David, putting their votes onto Jordan instead of Sam. Obviously with Jordan here being the safe vote. And let's talk about Jordan, who I will say I was kind of surprised that he ended up going home here from an editing standpoint, as again, I felt like Sam's downfall had been set up for quite a while at this point, to where I wouldn't have been surprised if they just said screw it and voted for her here anyway. But again, from a pure game standpoint, obviously it makes sense to go for Jordan here, even though I don't feel like the edit really backed that up. But as for Jordan himself, I mean, there really isn't much to say here. I mean, he barely gets any screen time across the season, but the only times he does get screen time is when he messed up the challenge in the pre-merge, and also when he got this like content around him trying to separate himself from like Sophie, and he had his like relationship with Amy. But like, again, like in the post-merge here, it's really no content outside of being Josh's cousin. Really, I feel like I know nothing about him as a figure on the show, and because of that, again, not really much to say about him. But with that, let's move on to episode 20, another really strong episode back-to-back here, where right away we do see the ramifications of the previous Tribal, where Josh is just pissed that Jordan is gone, and this is really the most personality we've seen from Josh on the season, where he ends up comparing Dave to Judas and talks about how they're all dumb and how he's targeting them now. So again, like, bitter Josh here was pretty fun to see, but really at this point, this does seem like a very clear 4v4 situation, with David having fully flipped to the other side, and initially Josh and Chrissy also seem to be remaining loyal to Mark and Sam, though along the way we do get some content from Chrissy thinking that this might be the time to flip, and tries to get Josh on board, and is unsuccessful in doing so. And really, this entire scene just felt completely out of place here, considering the exact opposite happens by the end of the episode, where Chrissy is the one to remain loyal and Josh is the one to flip. So again, really weird that made the cut. Now Mark does win immunity here, and with this massive bullseye that's now on Mark and Sam's backs, with them being the last remaining pair, the Purgatory 3 doesn't even bother to try countering the idols at this point, and they just decide to go for Sam. And really most of their content ends up being comprised by Geordie confessionals, which again is obviously the Australian Survivor standard, but also just feels weird, as there are literally scenes where Geordie isn't even at camp, and it is like a scene mostly focusing around KJ, but instead Geordie is the one narrating the entire sequence. It's like, why is this the thing? And again, just also underwhelming edit-wise, where you have like Shay and KJ, these people that should be top contenders at this point, to potentially win the game, getting shafted in the edit, and because of that making it seem like they have no real shot here. But we do then see Geordie campaign to Josh once again here, and seeming to be ineffective again, even though Josh does end up flipping by the end of the episode. Though realistically, I do think the things that more so factored into that were Jordan's reactions from the jury, but also Dave's campaigning later in the episode that I think was a bit more effective. But through the scene, obviously, we do see Geordie and Josh rebuilding their working relationship. But again, like, to me, it was Dave's campaigning that I think worked a bit better, where he does successfully sell this story that Sam's pretending that she had the idol in the last round was her backstabbing Jordan, and she's the one at fault for him going home. And this really felt ridiculous, that both Josh and Jordan seem to actually believe this. Again, Jordan is on the jury, really bitter at Sam, thinking that she backstabbed him. Josh also talks about feeling betrayed by Sam, and talks about that being one of the reasons why he ends up flipping his vote, when, again, in reality, David's the one that flipped. So again, this is effective work from David to shift the blame onto Sam, but just ridiculous that the prevailing thought from the cast here is that Sam is the one at fault for Jordan's boot, when really obviously she was just in self-preservation mode the entire time. But this all does lead up to another fun tribal here, and a lot of this is due to a lot of whispering that's going on here, where Josh and Dave end up talking to each other through Chrissy, which was funny. And even Chrissy is pointing out how angry Jordan looks on the jury, which seemed to be the final straw for Josh here. But really, Josh plays this entire tribal in a way that you can tell he's trying to flush Mark's idol, with him telling Mark and Sam right away that David isn't with them. He outright lies to Mark and Sam about what David is saying to him, and later, after the votes are cast, we directly have him telling Mark to play the idol on Sam, which she directly turns down, and with Josh ended up flipping on this vote, ends up obviously being a 5-3 vote, where Sam goes home, which did feel like a bit of a defining vote for this season, with the season's main narrator for most of this mid-game now being voted out. But I do want to talk about this vote from a couple perspectives here. First, from Josh's, where I think Josh just got really cute with this vote. I mean, the move here of voting for Sam and then telling them to play the idol really felt like he was trying to micromanage his relationships with Mark and Sam in the way that, one, the Jordy side of things, who he can now tell that, oh, I'm with you, I voted with you, but also with Mark and Sam at the same time. But again, this is all in a way that just makes it easy for it to backfire on him moving forward, as again, he is the one that flips here. But also, let's talk about this from Mark and Sam's perspective, which again, continuing off my thoughts on the previous episodes, with Mark having immunity here, there is no incentive to play the idol here. Again, unless they are 100% sure that Sam is going home, and also that they would be able to write it out from this point forward. Again, it is better for them as a duo, a couple that wants to just guarantee that one of them gets to the end and wins, with Mark obviously having the better chance to win at this point due to their relationships with the jury. It is obviously better for that duo to risk Sam going home here, as again, it would potentially leave Mark in the game at the final 7 with 2 idols in his pocket, to where he has Jordy as his meat shield, as someone that everyone knows is the biggest threat left in the game, that will need to be taken out at some point down the road, meaning that at worst, he really just needs to win one immunity challenge to get to the end. And that's in the case that he doesn't have the numbers surrounding him by that point either. So again, for me, I just feel like there's no real major downside to not playing the idol here, as no matter what happens with this round, it significantly boosts Mark's chances of winning the game if they have the 2 idols still in play. But with that, let's move on to talking about Sam, who again really proved to be a very savvy strategic player across the season in a way that did surprise me coming into it, where again, I had a pretty negative opinion of Sam as a player coming out of 2017. But again, she really proved me wrong here. She was the best positioned on her original tribe and seemed to be running the pre-merge on her tribes, only for that to all be halted at the merge due to her obviously having a husband in the game that had different relationships. But even then, she was able to make the best of that scenario where Mark and Sam were running the game alongside Josh and Jordan in the post-merge as well, where had it not been for Purgatory, Mark and Sam would have been in the final 6 with 2 idols in their pocket, with David also clearly being on the bottom moving forward. And even with Purgatory, she gets screwed by KJ's advantage, where Jordy would have been the easy boot there, and even beyond that, gets screwed by the jury's reactions and having to burn her social capital with her relationship with Josh being strained due to Jordan going out. And really, I just feel like Sam played a very impressive game that just got continuously knocked down by extenuating circumstances. Now, in terms of how the fan base viewed Sam, I genuinely don't get the vitriol there is for Sam online, where it seems like Sam is like one of the most hated players to ever play Australian Survivor. And I mean, yes, she did get this like villainous edit, but she never did anything in a mean-spirited way to deserve the hatred for her. I mean, I do feel like there is this like massive double standard here, where we had someone like David in All-Stars who dominated the season both in terms of strategy and screen time to the point where it made the season boring, which is, again, similar to what Sam did here. He also steals an idol from Phoebe, similar to what Sam did here, but he also does it in a way that he rubs it in Phoebe's face. He does it in a mean-spirited way, something that Sam never does here, yet for some reason David is universally adored by the fan base, while Sam is hated for doing the same things. Like, I genuinely don't get the hatred for Sam online when it comes to the idol stealing part of her game and like the more villainous elements of the game. But then also people hating her for like following around Mark. It's like, that's literally her husband, the person that she's going to share the prize with if they win. Like, obviously she is incentivized to make sure one of the two win. It doesn't matter if she wins, as long as Mark wins. So again, the people that are like upset at Sam for not playing self-interestedly, it's like, I wouldn't either if I was there with my spouse and my spouse had a better chance at winning the game. So again, I don't get the vitriol there is for Sam, and I genuinely do think she played one of the better games on this season. Now for episode 21, which does feel like the start of the end game, with the Sam boot being like the climax of the season. And I mean, really, they just make it so obvious that Mark's winning at this point. I mean, we started off with Mark telling Shay not to touch him, which I feel like is very questionable jury management there. But again, the edit doesn't portray it that way, as they use this as a way to transition to Mark being devastated that Sam is gone and him feeling responsible for her boot, and then we see him get emotional, and really all this was the exact content he needed to solidify his winning chances here after the Sam boot. But even beyond that, he gets so many winner quotes across this episode. I mean, he literally talks about how his one goal was to win, and everything he's done has been to win. He talks about how there is a path to the end now for him with 2 idols, and how he needs to make Sam proud and needs to get the job done. He brings up his son once again and says if he gets to the end, he's going to win. Again, all these very blatant winner quotes here. And we do see him eventually talk with Josh, where Josh puts all the blame for the flip onto Dave, and Dave himself takes credit for it while talking to Shay, leading to this really massive bump in content for David here, with there being a lot of talk about how big of a threat he is, where like Mark talks about how there are 3 people standing in his way to the end. You got Josh, Jordy, and then all of a sudden David, which again to me felt really ridiculous. Really felt like blame foreshadowing to the eventual David boot here. We do have them also talk about Jordy, where we get what is one of the most ridiculous confessionals in the history of the show to me, where Mark says, Jordy's a trained gardener and I'm a trained killer. And this line just made me laugh so hard. It gets so dumb. But obviously we get more of the same from Jordy, with him gloating over to Sambu, and we do see him and Josh agree to work together, leading us to the reward, which was a spa day, and instantly we see all the women agree to take each other if they win. Cut to Shay, Jordy, and Josh being in the final 3 of the comp, and Jordy makes a deal to throw the comp to Shay, where Shay will take the both of them on the reward. And again, this is just terrible from Shay to see her just blatantly turning her back on the women here. And Jordy gets a lot of credit in the edit here for tricking Shay into doing this, and we later get a comment about how this was the most expensive spa day ever for Shay. That really sunk her winning chances here. But on the reward, the 3 of them agree to work together with the plan to split the votes on Mark and Dave, with Dave being the intended target, as they expect Mark to play his idol, which is exactly what ends up happening here. As for the others, we do see them agree to target Jordy now as the biggest threat, and with him having just pulled off that move at the reward, with Dave seeming to lead this charge, which I will say that this is probably the optimal move here. While the edit does show David as this like newly minted big threat, I do feel like Jordy is more dangerous in the game, particularly for Mark here. So to me, it did feel like Jordy being the boot here was the correct move, though again, the edit does give Mark some of the credit for putting the target onto Dave. Now, eventually, Josh ends up winning immunity, and the plan does come together to flush Mark's idol, and Dave seems to be the clear boot, though we do get this segment about Chrissy wanting Jordy gone, and Josh wanting Dave gone, and that they have the power to decide who goes home, which, again, is just weird that this is here considering they end up voting separately by the end of the episode. We do also see Shay trying to rebuild trust with KJ, which this entire situation seemed to actually cause KJ to separate from Jordy, with her realizing she's on the bottom of their grouping. Jordy also tries to get Dave to throw his vote onto Mark, which he fails at, which is the typical Jordy thing. And before Tribal, we do get this weird scene of Mark talking to Shay and Shay telling Mark to play his idol. And then the edit really props up Mark here, making it as if he has this great read on the game and how he tricks Shay into telling him this information when, again, it seemed clear that he was going to play his idol here anyway. And it seemed clear that everyone was telling him to play his idol. But again, we do get the Tribal where through Mark playing his idol, we do get a tie between Dave and Jordy, with Dave getting voted out on the revote, which again, I get for pretty much everyone here except for Mark, considering Jordy was directly targeting Mark, but whatever, it works out for him. But it is insane to me that he didn't end up going for Jordy in this situation. But with that, let's talk about Juicy Dave, who is one of the players that came into the season with no game knowledge about the show, but did seem to pick up on it along the way. I mean, that being said, I do think it's easy to forget how terrible his first few rounds were, particularly episode 3. And really, I remember expecting him to be one of the boots pretty soon afterwards. So I am surprised he actually got this far. But really, as a personality, I did feel like he was mostly bland, really outside of his lack of game knowledge. I don't think he really brought that much to the show. I mean, the most interesting things about him to me were the fact that he went by Juicy Dave and the fact that he was Brianna's father, which I will say, to see him get really emotional in his final words over wishing he could have won it for Brianna. I mean, that was a very touching moment. But again, for the most part, I really didn't get much from him on this season. And now let's jump into episode 22, which was back to being another mundane episode where it was pretty clear to me that Jordy was on his way out. Again, with the editing, painting him as this Benji figure, with Sam being his Matt Rogers, and I was expecting Jordy to go around this point, not too long after Sam. And because this round ended up being kind of boring to me, with the main source of intrigue being whether or not Mark was going to play his idol, we do get more of the same storylines of Mark and Jordy targeting each other with Josh in the middle. We do finally get a segment about Chrissy and Josh's relationship, again, all the way in episode 22. But here we do see the re-solidification of the Mark, Josh, and Chrissy contingent that I did feel pretty confident was going to hold true, despite us seeing Jordy do his typical unsuccessful scrambling, and he isn't even able to keep his own side in line, with KJ having flipped against him in the last round. Now we do have a somewhat interesting immunity challenge where it does come down to the puzzle, where we do see Chrissy give up and instead help Josh, leading to him beating out Jordy. And I know people were upset at this, but I personally have no issue with this. Again, there's precedent for this being allowed in the past, and I do think it is fair game as long as you don't directly help, which would be against the rules. Now, I do think it takes away from the point of immunity challenges, where the point is to give people on the bottom a chance to survive, and through the majority being able to gang up to help one specific person beat out that person in the minority. Obviously, that takes away from the point of the challenge, but I mean, I never cared about challenges to begin with. And really, I do feel like most of the outrage here really comes from the fact that this was all against Jordy, who people looked at as the main opposition against Mark here. Now, beyond this, you could tell that Jordy knew he was going home, where he pretty much stops trying to actually target Mark, instead approaches Mark to vote for Shay, who he does end up voting for, making this feel like a final act of desperation from him. But really, most of the suspense comes down to Mark's idol, where he does end up playing it, but does so in a situation where he didn't need to here, with him getting no votes. But I really don't blame him for it personally. I mean, as I would do the same thing in this position, where everyone had just voted for him in the previous round, and there's obviously the suspicion of him having the second idol, so there was reason to believe that they were going to vote for him. But considering we do see Sam on the jury shaking her head at him playing the idol, it did seem pretty clear that even the jury knew that he was going to be safe. And it does make this second idol, which he dubs the ghost of Jesse, the idol that Sam stole from Jesse, it does make it go out in a whimper here, despite being such a major storyline across the season. Also, he does decide to make this speech about how Jesse's idol is going to knock Jordy out of the game, and this did feel a bit unnecessary. I do think on paper this does play up this move to the jury, which can prop up Mark as a player, though I do feel like the execution of it was just kind of awkward, and it felt like he was just kicking Jordy while he was down. And while Jordy does take it in stride, again, I don't think it played out as he intended, and also I just feel like it was mostly unnecessary in the sense that I think he was going to win a jury vote against anybody but Josh anyway. So I don't think he needed to play up this idol play, but again, doesn't really play much of a factor. But with that, obviously Jordy is the boot here, and Jordy is clearly one of the biggest characters on this season, with him having this massive underdog run and getting pretty close to the end here. But to be honest, I kind of found his edit to be kind of annoying, especially by the end of it, where we just get so much content based around his rivalry with Sam and him calling himself the Joker. And by the end of his run, I mean, he was getting like 10 confessionals an episode talking about this. It's like the same thing over and over again. I do think it played a factor into me probably not enjoying him as much of a TV presence as what the edit intended. Also, I do feel like his gameplay across season is greatly overstated in the edit, where, I mean, I don't think he does anything across season that's that impressive gameplay-wise, especially to warrant this grandiose edit. I mean, like, even in comparison to like someone like a Benji. Like, Benji at least has the Matt Rogers blind side, and also has him like pacifying Tegan, like has these things that make him stand out as a player. Like, Jordy doesn't really have that here, where I can't name one individual movie mixed across season that was overly impressive to me. That being said, I do think Jordy is actually one of the more competent players on this cast, where I think he might be the only player across the season that I actually agree with pretty much everything he does strategically across the season. I do think he is someone that has a good strategic mind for the game. The problem is his execution. As I've mentioned many times in this review, he cannot execute his plans, and that is a major issue. That despite him having the right idea, he's never able to convince people to actually go through with that idea. And that's my biggest issue with Jordy's game. But I mean, clearly he is one of the more notable figures from this season, and is someone I fully expect to see play again. In which, I mean, if he doesn't have this big target on his back, I could see him doing very well in return. Now for episode 23, which I will say that I did like how the beginning of this episode was structured, where we finally get a balanced edit, where we get these segments to check up on each of the final 5. We do start with this really jarring scene from Chrissy of her like being regularly braggadocious over her position in the game, which really felt ridiculous to me considering it seems like she's clearly not the winner at this point. And she talks about how she flushed Mark's idol and called him a silly soldier, which all this felt like negative content for Mark, but we follow this up with Mark supporting that through talking about having played the idol poorly, but then he gets to talk about his family again, which really dispelled any thought of him not winning the season. Josh then ends up outlining this dilemma that him and Mark work through these final rounds here, of them wanting each other at 4 as meat shields, but also knowing that they are each other's biggest threats. And I did find it to be an interesting dynamic with the upcoming vote here. But before that, we do get the setup of Shay being this easy boot. And what do you know? Shay wins immunity. And with that, again, we do get a really interesting vote here, with KJ wanting to get the women together to get to 3, which is her optimal move, and really the optimal move of all the women here. But she also can't trust Chrissy to get rid of Josh, so here we have them approach Mark to blindside Josh, which, I mean, I think in many ways is the optimal move for the women for sure, in the sense that obviously you can't get the 4 of Josh and Chrissy, at least on paper, as you would assume that Chrissy would never flip on Josh. But ironically, this is really what ends up costing KJ the game here, where Mark and Josh agree to vote for KJ, and we do see Josh doing a lot of work on Chrissy to convince her to go his way, but instead she decides that now is the time for her to make a move to differentiate herself from Josh by voting out Mark, and this did seem like a move made a bit too late. I mean, in many ways it reminded me of like Sarah's move to vote out Ben in Winners at War, where she always intended to go to the end with Tony, but makes a really late move there to try to just put a move on her resume that really doesn't end up gaining her that much at all. And again, for Chrissy here, it was just too late. I don't think this would have changed anything had she gotten to the end with Josh, and really just propels distrust between her and Josh. But this does lead to Mark picking up on Chrissy having flipped, which leads to one of his better individual moves across the season, where we do see him do really effective work in tricking KJ and Shay to thinking that he's on board with the Josh boot, essentially leading to KJ causing her own vote off here, which again, credit to Mark here for saving himself and getting his way with the vote here. And I think at the end of the day, it is probably his optimal move. Now, obviously, there are dangers to really both options here. I mean, taking out Josh pretty much guarantees that he is out at 4 if he does not win immunity. And with Shay being obviously in this really good position to win any sort of endurance comp, I mean, that is a very precarious position to be in. While in the real life scenario here, where he does keep Josh around, it is also dangerous to go to 4 with Josh and Chrissy, and also allowing this threat in Josh to get so close to the end, but it does also give him more outs in the case that he doesn't win immunity there. So again, I think at the end of the day, this was definitely the correct decision to make, though when the initial dilemma was brought up, I did initially question which one was better. Now, I will say for Mark, though, I do think in an ideal world, the move is actually to get rid of Chrissy here, though obviously that was kind of impossible to do considering no one else would have been on board, considering KJ and Shay needed her in the game in order to have a chance at winning the game, while also Josh had no real incentive to vote out Chrissy at this point, so again, I don't think it would have been effective anyway. But we do get the tribal where it was fun to see like 3 different plans going on, leading to a 2-2-1 vote, again with KJ having essentially caused her own boot here by not voting for Mark with Chrissy, which ends up leading to her being voted out on the revote, which is a really sucky way to end up leaving the game here. And with that, let's talk about KJ, who I did like across the season. I mean, while I would have preferred her to play a bit more of a flashy game, especially when she was at the bottom for a lot of it, I do feel like she demonstrated a decent amount of potential here and probably would have seemed like a winner candidate had she gotten more of a consistent edit, where she ends up being one of these players that is only shown when necessary, with her not even being prominent in the edit until the Sophie vote off. So I do wish we got to see more of her, though she did seem like a mostly rational player that wasn't really given much run right here. And really, I mean, after watching her like Jury Villa video, I do really feel for KJ, where I don't get the animosity that the jury had towards her, and that entire situation felt kind of icky, but as a whole, again, I do like KJ, and I actually wouldn't be opposed to seeing her play again. But with that, let's jump into the finale, which starts off with some game recaps for each of the players, and they obviously spend time with everyone here, but they really do hone in on Mark here, with him getting to outline pretty much every aspect of his game, while the others got these like very brief segments. But also here we do get the setup that once again Shay is the biggest target on the board, but what do you know, she wins immunity again. Who would have guessed it? But for the immunity challenge, we did get some awkwardness from Australian Survivor doing their like loved ones segment before the challenge, but the loved ones aren't actually there and instead have to call in through the phone, which wasn't nearly as impactful here. But as for the vote itself, I mean, we do initially see Josh and Mark walk off and agree to vote for Chrissy, and right away I was thinking, okay, this has to be a ploy from both of them. Again, why would they want to take each other to the end? But I mean, it turns out that Josh actually wanted to do this, and I don't get why. I get like this concept of him approaching Mark about doing this plan. Again, that is the optimal move, but it's not the optimal move to actually go along with it. I mean, at that point, you for sure should be trying to get Chrissy to vote alongside you, and that should be your main plan, not to actually take out Chrissy and bring Mark a much bigger jury threat to the end. Again, it is insane to me that he essentially like picks Mark over Chrissy here, especially considering how he just talked in the previous episode about how it's better to get to the end against people you can beat instead of people who you think are the best. And really all this like kind of shocks me, as I came into this episode expecting that there was going to be this big Mark versus Josh battle. But for Josh to just like kind of drop the ball here was kind of underwhelming, especially from a player who had been pretty consistently strong throughout the entire post-merge. And obviously here we do see Mark instantly talk about how he's not going along with this plan, and he goes to Chrissy and tells her to vote Josh out, and he gets to talk about his entire strategy of using Josh as a shield, which really becomes a big talking point for Mark in this finale. And really that was all that was really necessary for this vote, because with Josh voting for Chrissy and Shay and Mark voting for Josh, there's really no suspense here, because at worst it's going to be a 2-1-1 vote, with Chrissy only having the option of voting for Josh or Mark. She can't vote for herself, obviously. So again, there's not really much suspense here, but they do spend a lot of time on Chrissy here, who does have this moral dilemma, as she had remained loyal to Josh the entire season up to this point, but now ends up having to flip against him, and again seeming to think that this is like a single move that's gonna give her a chance at winning the game, where this does end up reminding me a lot of the Ken move, where he takes out David in Millennials vs. Gen X, and it really just leads to other people getting the credit for you making the move, where it makes it look like people convinced you to flip against your closest ally, more so than it was your proactive move to actually do so. And I do think that is a factor here where, again, Chrissy really gains nothing from doing this, outside of just pissing off Josh. But again, so Josh does go home unanimously here, and Josh is a strange figure on this season, where he is a player that dominated from beginning to end, with the only points of him being in danger are at the Final Four here, where he does go home, and also at points where the Purgatory Twist had a direct influence on how the numbers shaped up, where this is debatably, for me, the best non-winning game of Australian Survivor up to this point. But for some reason, the edit just didn't care to show it. And it is really weird to me that this Josh style player is being purpled here, despite the fact that he is typically one of these players that Australian Survivor would have the easiest time editing. So for them to just forgo him in the edit is really bizarre to me. And part of that might just be due to how boring he is. But for someone who had the amount of win equity that he had, especially in the endgame here, and for him not to even get a prominent edit until the post-merge really just sapped all the suspense of the endgame for the season, as he should have been someone that rivaled Mark in terms of winner contention, but it really just did not seem to be the case. But beyond this, really the rest of the episode is just a coronation for Mark here. I mean, no suspense at all. I mean, they really spend a lot of time on this personal story from Mark, talking about his time in the military and him losing a comrade. And obviously that is a really sad story and does lead to a nice moment here with Mark talking about how he's going to replace those memories with that of Survivor. And that was something. The Final Tribal here is really tame, with everyone just giving Mark really softball questions and him getting to extensively talk about his game, going from move to move, person to person. And he performs as well as you would think someone would when they have the entire jury on their side. And really, the jury doesn't even hide that they're going to vote for Mark here, where like Jesse spends his entire question propping up Mark. We see people make faces when like Shay says that she's an 8 out of 10 player. Josh seemed to be really upset at Chrissy, but didn't really have that negativity thrown at Mark either. And like, really, Mark was the very clear winner for a lot of this season. And he ends up dominating this jury vote here, winning in a unanimous vote. But of course, with this being Australian Survivor, we have the waste time with family members coming out before the vote reveal. And this was really egregious to me, with them spending so much time on Mark and his family, like first talking to his son on a video call and then having his parents come out and talking to them. And again, all this was so boring to me, really sapped all the momentum from the jury vote here, though obviously Mark was going to win. But with that, let's wrap up the video here by talking about the final three, starting off with Chrissy, who was a fine character. She certainly had some fun reactions throughout the season and was one of the more lighthearted figures on the cast in a season that is, for the most part, pretty dark. And she's someone that obviously the edit really wanted you to like, but for me, again, like her overall lack of game knowledge was a major reason why I do feel like this season was as stagnant as it was, with her just being in this kingmaker position throughout most of the game and almost always siding with Josh throughout the season and not really doing much to break out of that perception. It wasn't until the very end here that she finally does some things independently, and even then, it was never going to be effective. Now, she does seem to be good socially, though never really utilizes those social relationships for game purposes. And really just overall, I just don't feel like she knows the game well enough to know how to play optimally here, which made her a bit of a frustrating player to watch, but again, still did bring some humor to this very dark season. Then we got Shay, who, I think played poorly. I mean, she was a target from right before the merge, was consistently on the bottom, never being able to execute a single move across the season, while also having some really questionable strategic decisions along the way, and having been voted out and came back to the game. That makes her, to me, one of the worst players to make Final Tribal really in the history of the show to me. So I really don't think she played a good game. I found her being mostly boring on the show as well, with her being kind of like KJ in the sense that they were shafted in the edit unless they were absolutely necessary to the story, though Shay did get a bit more personal content throughout the season that did make her win slightly more realistic, but I always got the sense from her edit that she was kind of this more Flick style of edit, Flick from Brains vs. Brawn, in the sense that they were going to make a deep run, but never actually win the season. And really, at the end of the day, Shay just really didn't do much for me. And finally, let's talk about our winner in Mark, who, again, really upped his game from 2017 here. I mean, having one of the most dominant performances in all of Australian Survivor, so much so that it made this season really boring, but I still have to applaud his gameplay. Now, I don't necessarily agree with every move he made along the way, but he was still able to remain in the majority alliance throughout the season, with Purgatory playing a major factor in why he faces so much adversity in the endgame here. And despite having those two idols and being a physical competitor, he only really needed immunity for one round in that endgame, And even then, he wouldn't have even been a target at 7 there had it not been for the fact that he publicly had an idol. And everyone knew he was going to play the idol. So really, even that, I don't really fault him too much for, especially when also adding in the fact that, again, Purgatory definitely played a factor into that. And really, had it not been for Purgatory, he would have had the game already won by that point, where they were at the final 6 with 2 idols, and Sam's still in the game. And even if Josh had made a move at the final 7 there, Mark would have still been in a decent position at that point, having 2 idols to play in the last 2 rounds before the final 4, and then just needing a single immunity or scraping his way through like he did in real life to end up winning the game. I really applaud him for the way that he was able to avoid getting voted out by effectively using Josh as a shield in the end game here, which was an impressive display of gameplay. And to be honest, I would actually debate him as potentially the top winner in the history of the show, in my eyes, had it not been for the Blood versus Water theme, where obviously in Blood versus Water, he does have Sam working for him to propel his game over hers, and that's something that obviously knocks him below someone like a David, who didn't really have that. But I do feel like in terms of consistency across the season, I do feel like Mark played a more consistently dominant game than David did. And also was more harmed by twists in the end game than David was as well. Where again, having 3 people come back at the final 6 is insane. And that is a lot of adversity for you to face off against, especially when that 3 is eventually given an advantage to use against you as well. So again, I do find Mark's game overall here very, very impressive. But again, from an edit perspective, it was just so obvious that he was going to win pretty much from the premiere to me. And like, even if you don't follow Edgix super closely, it's like by the end game, there really is no other option for who is going to win this season. That it really does take all the suspense out of the season here, which is a fundamental flaw of the editing of Australian Survivor just in general, that they make their winner edits way too blatant, and that they completely neglect so many people in the edit, even people that do make it very far into the season, that make them people that can't possibly win either. And this is an issue that obviously people have been bringing up with this season. But I think the issue with production here is that they don't look at this as a flaw, where they do really want to prop up their winners to have a satisfying conclusion and don't really care to cater towards the audience that really does pay attention to the edit of their show. And I will say, I do think Mark actually made things pretty difficult for the editors across this season, where, again, there are so many things that just by looking at the raw footage, you can tell that it makes Mark come off very negatively. However, I think the editors really try to go out of their way to show him in a more positive light, whether that be through having him or other people rationalize these more negative elements of his game, or trying to spin things that are negative into positive things, which I find kind of humorous, considering, I feel like 100% the intention of this season's edit was to redeem Mark and make Mark a more likable figure, and I don't feel like those tactics end up being effective for most of the online community here, where so much of the online community was upset that Mark won and was actively rooting against Mark. Which again, I feel like that's the complete opposite take that the editors wanted you to have, but through watching just the raw footage and considering how not super interesting he is in confessional, I do feel like it's still left with a lot of the online community being pretty negative towards Mark, despite how much they were trying to make him more likable. But again, for me personally, I don't have an issue with Mark's win here. Again, I think he by far played the best game, especially of this final 3 and debatably the entire season. I also feel like his win really fulfills the themes of Blood versus Water, where again, so much of this season revolves around Mark and Sam and how they utilize this Blood versus Water theme to end up dominating the game. And I think for one of them to not win this season would have made this a lesser season in my eyes. So I was overall satisfied with the conclusion here. But there we go. I mean, that is the entire season, which as a whole is a season that I do find pretty underwhelming. Again, it has the typical flaws of Australian Survivor, with it having a bloated length, uneven editing, and really over the top and repetitive presentation. And with this season having a pretty mediocre cast as a whole, largely perpetuated by this Blood vs. Water theme, where I just didn't find most of this cast compelling, and we also had some stagnant gameplay along the way that didn't help things either. I mean, again, to me, this was not the greatest season of Survivor, but despite that, I do think there are some pros for this season, particularly in how the Blood vs. Water theme plays within the gameplay. Again, while I don't like it from a casting perspective, I do think it brings a lot of interesting dynamics throughout the season, with having players having to deal with playing with their loved ones, and we did get some big moments here and there. I mean, obviously the Jesse blindside, the Jordan boot, the Juicy Dave tribal. I mean, there were some good moments here and there, but overall, I do still find this season to be on the lower end of Australian Survivor seasons, with there being a serious debate for this being the worst of the bunch. but certainly not a season without any merit to it. So with that, those are my thoughts on Australian Survivor Blood vs. Water. Now, as usual, I will be doing a player ranking for the season, which hopefully will be out within a week from when this video comes out. We do also have Survivor 42 going on, so expect a mid-season power ranking for that. Also, I will be doing a merge boot and final juror ranking for Australian Survivor at some point before the next season comes out, so stay tuned for those as well. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.